I know what they're saying. Annie Carter spoke softly. She stood beside William Hartman's table, one hand holding a silver water pitcher, the other with a neatly folded white napkin draped over her wrist. "Sir," Annie began, then suddenly stopped. William did not look up. He held his fork in one hand and had just separated a piece of fish on his plate when Annie tried again. "Sir, please." Only then did William lift his eyes halfway. "What is it?" Annie swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something." Before William could answer, Diane Mercer turned sharply toward her. She was seated close to William's right side, an open leather folder in front of her, one hand resting on the edge of the contract. "What is this?" Diane asked. "What is this waitress doing standing beside Mr. Hartman and whispering in his ear?" Annie's face flushed. William gave a slight wave of his hand, the kind of gesture one might use to brush away smoke or a fly. "Go away. I am having dinner." "Sir, if you could give me just a few minutes." "Later," William said, turning slightly back toward his plate. "Whatever it is, tell me later." "This cannot wait." That made William stop, not because he believed her, but because he was not used to being interrupted before he had finished speaking. He placed his fork down carefully. "Young lady, can't you see I am entertaining guests?" Across from him, Alejandro Ruiz raised his glass of wine and took a slow sip. Etienne Moreau adjusted his cuff and looked down into his glass. Luca Bellini leaned back, holding his red wine, silently watching. None of the three men said a word. William's expression tightened. Does this restaurant allow its staff to disturb guests like this? Annie's throat went dry. Diane gently placed a hand on William's sleeve, as if protecting him from some minor annoyance. "Mr. Hartman, please let me handle this." Then she turned to Annie. "That is enough. Whatever you think this is, you need to return to your station." "I am not trying to cause trouble," Annie said. "I am only trying to warn him." Diane gave a soft laugh. "Warn him?" Annie looked straight at William. "Sir, please don't sign yet. Just stay a few more minutes. I have something very important to tell you." William leaned back in his chair. His movement was still controlled, but the patience in his eyes had nearly run out. "I have 3 international partners sitting in front of me. I have a contract on the table. I have a private interpreter here for a reason. And you are a member of the restaurant staff. There are rules to follow." "I know there are rules." "Then follow them." He reached for his glass of water, took a small sip, and set it down. "Excuse me." William pushed back his chair and stood. Diane looked up at him. "Mr. Hartman, I will be back in a minute." He left the table without another word and walked toward the private hallway that led to the restrooms. Annie remained frozen beside the table. Diane's eyes followed William until he disappeared around the corner. Then she leaned slightly toward Annie. "You have gone too far," she said under her breath. "Go back to the kitchen before you lose more than your paycheck." Annie looked down at the contract folder, then at the pen beside William's plate. Alejandro took another sip of wine. Etienne dabbed lightly at the corner of his mouth with his napkin. Luca studied the color of the wine in his glass as though nothing unusual had happened. Annie turned away from the table, but she did not head toward the kitchen. She moved quickly along the edge of the dining room, past the service area, past the small alcove where the spare menus were kept, and straight into the private hallway. "Annie!" Harold Briggs hissed behind her. "Where are you going?" She did not stop. William had made it halfway down the hallway when he heard her footsteps behind him. He turned around at once. The calm disappeared from his face. "Are you following me?" Annie stopped a few steps away from him. "Sir, please. I am sorry, but no." William's voice rose. Not loud enough for the whole dining room to hear, but enough to make Annie flinch. "This is completely unacceptable. You interrupted my dinner, ignored my interpreter, and now you are following me to the restroom? I know how this looks. Do you?" William stepped closer, his jaw tight with anger. "Because from where I stand, you are creating a scene in a restaurant where I am trying to complete an important business deal. I did not mean to embarrass you. You are doing a remarkable job of it for someone who isn't trying." Annie pressed the water pitcher against her apron with both hands. Only then did she realize she was still holding it. William pointed toward the dining room. "Go back there, right now. Please," she said. "Just a few minutes. I told you, later. If you sign, there may not be a later." William's eyes narrowed. "Enough." At that moment, Diane appeared at the end of the hallway. She had followed them from the dining room. "Mr. Hartman," Diane called, quickening her steps. "There you are." Then she saw Annie standing nearby, still holding the water pitcher. Diane stopped. Her eyes moved from William to Annie, then back to William. "What is she doing here?" William exhaled sharply through his nose. "That is what I am trying to understand." Diane turned to Annie. "Why are you following him?" Annie tightened her grip on the pitcher. "I am not." "You followed him from the table into a private hallway," Diane said. "After you were told to leave. After interrupting a confidential business dinner. What in the world do you think you are doing?" "I am trying to tell him something important." "You are a waitress," Diane said, her voice low but sharp. "You are not allowed to chase guests down hallways because you want attention." "This is not about attention." Diane stepped closer. "Then what is it about?" Annie looked at William. He was still angry, still ready to send her away. But he had not entered the restroom. He had not called Harold to drag her out. He was still standing there, and that meant he was still listening. Annie decided to risk everything. "I know what they were saying," she said. "The Spanish man, the French man, the Italian man. I heard them talking while I was pouring water." For a split second, Diane's expression changed. But she quickly regained her composure. Diane gave a small laugh. "This is ridiculous." Annie did not answer her. She looked at William. "Sir, I know I should not have followed you. I know I could lose my job. But I heard enough to know that you should not sign that contract until someone else reviews it." William looked toward the dining room, then back at Annie. "You expect me to believe that you understood 3 different conversations in 3 different languages right at my table?" "Yes, sir." "And you thought the proper way to handle that was to chase me all the way to the restroom?" Annie's cheeks burned. "No, sir. I thought the proper way was to speak to you before you signed, but you told me to go away. So I followed you because I was afraid you would go back to the table and sign your name before I had another chance." Diane folded her arms. "Mr. Hartman, this is exactly why staff should not be allowed near confidential documents." "I was pouring water," Annie said, "and I was listening." She took a deep breath and continued. "They were speaking privately in languages they thought no one around them could understand." Diane's eyes turned cold. "Careful." William turned slightly toward Diane. "Why did you say that?" Diane blinked. "Say what?" "Careful." "I meant she should be careful about making accusations she cannot prove." Annie drew in a steady breath. "I can prove it." Diane's voice snapped before she could soften it. "No, you cannot." Now William's eyes shifted fully to Diane. And it was no longer a gentle look. He had known Diane for 5 years. She rarely showed anger unless she intended to use it as a weapon. But just now, she had lost her composure because of a waitress holding a water pitcher. That mattered. "What did she hear?" William asked. Diane answered too quickly. "Nothing accurate." "I asked her." Annie looked from Diane to William. "They talked about a shell company. The Spanish man said the transfer would happen as soon as you signed. The French man said the legal burden would fall on you if the deal was investigated as fraud. And the Italian man joked that you did not even know the knife was already in your hand." William's face did not change. Men like him trained themselves not to show emotion too easily, but the color around the corners of his mouth shifted. Diane cut in. "She is making this up." "No," Annie said. "You heard them too. Then you told him they were talking about trust, partnership, and a long future together." Diane stepped close enough for Annie to smell her perfume. "You have no idea what you are getting involved in." "I know enough. You know nothing about international contracts. I know when a translation is false." William raised one hand. "Both of you, stop." Diane immediately turned to him. "William, we should go back to the table. Alejandro, Etienne, and Luca are waiting. This girl is wasting your time," Annie said. "Then please let me waste 2 more minutes." William looked at her. Annie's voice trembled, but she kept speaking. "Get the folder. Choose any page they marked for signature. Let me show you one sentence. Just one. If I am wrong, I will leave. You can fire me. I will not argue." Diane laughed, but the sound was forced. "You are not allowed to touch that folder." "I do not need to touch it," Annie said. "You can hold it. He can hold it. I can read it from where I stand." William glanced down the hallway. Harold Briggs appeared near the corner, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He pretended to arrange a stack of menus on a small side table. "Mr. Briggs," William called. Harold hurried forward. Yes, Mr. Hartman, I am terribly sorry. I will remove her at once. No, William said. Bring me the folder from my table. Harold froze. The folder, sir? The folder. Now. Diane's voice dropped. William, you cannot be serious. At last, William looked directly into her eyes. I am serious enough not to sign anything I have not properly checked. Harold immediately went back to the dining room. Annie stood still, afraid that if she moved, all the courage inside her would vanish at once. William looked at her for a moment. Why would you risk your job? Annie looked down at the floor, then forced herself to meet his eyes. Because I know what it feels like when people with papers in their hands take everything from people who do not understand what they are signing. Diane said nothing. A minute later, Harold returned with the leather folder. He held it out with both hands, as though he were handing over evidence in a courtroom. William took it and opened it to the marked pages. Show me, he said. Annie stepped closer. She pointed to the first paragraph in Spanish. Start here, she said. This sentence does not mean what she told you it meant. William looked down at the words he could not read. Then he looked up at Diane. William Hartman stood in the middle of the hallway, holding the open document folder in his hands. One thumb pressed firmly against the corner of the page to keep it from slipping. He looked at Annie. You said this first paragraph does not mean what Diane told me it meant. Yes, sir. Then read it. Annie glanced at Diane, then lowered her eyes back to the page. In Spanish, this paragraph says, upon signing, the selected assets shall be transferred to the international management structure of Valterra Bridge Holdings. William turned to the next page. This section is in French? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Read it. Diane moved half a step forward. William, I strongly object to turning a private business agreement into a hallway performance. At last, William looked at her. Then make it less of a performance. Let her read one sentence. Diane said nothing. Annie leaned slightly closer to the document. The French paragraph was fairly long. She read slowly. In the event of an investigation, civil claim, asset freeze, or review by a government agency, Hartman Development Group shall remain the primary liable party for all claims made before and after this agreement is executed. William waited. Annie translated it carefully, word by word, so he could clearly understand the meaning. It means that if there is an investigation, a civil lawsuit, an asset freeze, or a government review of this deal, Hartman Development Group will still be the party primarily responsible for every claim, both before and after you sign. Harold muttered, My God. Then he immediately looked as though he regretted being alive. Diane shot him a cold glance. William's hand tightened around the folder. In the meeting, you told me this was shared liability. Diane answered quickly, because in practical effect, that is how it operates. Annie looked up. No, ma'am. In practical effect, if something goes wrong, his name is the one that will be held responsible. Diane turned sharply toward her. Do not pretend you understand legal consequences. I understand enough to know when blame is being hidden behind elegant language. William stared at Diane. Why didn't you mention the asset freeze? It was not relevant to the section being discussed. Not relevant to me? The negotiation was moving quickly. Annie said, Everything will move much faster after he signs. William turned to another page. What about this? Annie leaned forward again. It is in Italian. Read it. Diane's voice sharpened. William. Diane, he said quietly. Do not interrupt again. That stopped her more effectively than anger would have. Annie read the line on the page. If Hartman disputes the transfer after signing, Valterra Bridge Holdings shall have the right to suspend the related capital channels until the dispute is resolved. William's expression did not change at first. Translate it. Annie spoke slowly. If Hartman objects to the transfer after the agreement has been signed, Valterra Bridge Holdings may temporarily freeze or suspend the related capital channels until the dispute is resolved. William stared at the page. Related capital channels? It may refer to project accounts, Diane said. Only temporarily. A standard leverage clause. Annie shook her head. It does not say project accounts. It says related capital channels. That wording can be very broad. Very broad. William looked at Diane. How broad? Diane lifted her chin. That is a question for a lawyer. I thought that was why I brought you here. I am your interpreter, not your lawyer. But you were confident enough to tell me it was safe. Diane did not answer. From the dining room came the soft clink of glasses. The three men at table 12 still had not come looking for William. That bothered him. If a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars was being delayed, honest partners would ask questions. Nervous partners would come into the hallway, but those three men were simply sitting there, drinking wine and waiting. William turned to Harold. The Madison room. Is it available? Yes, sir. It is empty. Take us there. Harold blinked. All of you, sir? William looked at Annie. Her too. Diane's voice dropped. You are bringing a restaurant employee into a confidential document review? I am bringing the only person in this building who translated the contract without requiring me to sign it first. Annie lowered her head, not knowing how to react to that. William noticed that she was still holding the water pitcher. Can you put that down? Annie carefully set the pitcher on a narrow table against the wall. Diane stepped closer as they walked toward the Madison room. Her voice was so low it was almost a whisper. You think this will end well for you? Annie kept walking. I don't know. You think he will protect you? I don't know that either. Then why do you keep talking? Annie stopped just outside the private room. Because I know what happens when powerful people sign papers they have not truly read, and powerless people are the ones who pay the price. Diane's eyes went cold. You have no idea what kind of world you just stepped into. Annie answered softly, I have lived my whole life at the bottom of that world. If Annie's words touched your heart, please give this video a like. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because your voice matters here. And if you believe in truth, courage, and justice for the people who are often ignored, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. William, who had already stepped into the Madison room, heard enough to turn around. Is there a problem? Diane smiled. No problem at all, William. Annie said nothing. William placed the folder in the middle of the table. My phone is still at the dining table. I'll get it, Harold said at once. And tell my guests I need a few minutes. What should I say if they ask why, sir? William looked down at the folder, then at Diane. Tell them I am reviewing the language in the contract. Harold quickly left. Diane remained near the door. Annie stood beside a chair but did not dare sit down. William pulled one out. Sit. Annie hesitated. That was not a suggestion, he said, then seemed to realize his tone had been too harsh and corrected himself. Please. She sat on the edge of the chair. William opened the folder again. We start from the beginning. Annie looked at him. Every page? Every lie. Diane folded her arms. This is absurd. William did not look at her. What is absurd is that I needed a waitress to tell me what my own interpreter did not. Annie lowered her eyes to the first page. Her hands were still trembling, but her voice had grown steadier. The cover page is clean, she said. The trap begins in the appendix. William's face slowly turned pale. Harold returned with William's phone in one hand and a face that had lost all confidence. They asked if there was a problem, Harold said. William looked up from the folder. Who asked? Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Moreau and Mr. Bellini didn't say much. They're still at the table. Drinking? Harold hesitated. Yes, sir. William gave a dry, humorless sound. Of course they are. Diane stood near the door with her arms folded, no longer pretending to be relaxed. William, this has gone far enough. You have embarrassed your partners, disrupted a private signing, and allowed an employee of the restaurant to make reckless accusations based on fragments she does not understand. Annie kept her eyes on the pages. I understand the fragments just fine. Diane turned toward her. You understand words. That is not the same as understanding business. Annie looked up. Sometimes business is just theft wearing a better suit. Harold shifted as if he wished the floor would open. William did not smile. He was looking at Annie differently now. Not warmly, not kindly, but with attention. It made Annie more nervous than his anger had. Anger was familiar. Attention from powerful men usually came with a cost. He placed his phone on the table. Thomas Reed. Diane's expression changed. Your outside counsel? My independent counsel, William said. Yes, that is unnecessary. I'll decide that. He tapped the screen and called. It rang 4 times before an older man's voice answered, thick with sleep and irritation. William, if this is about the Zurich language again, I told you to stop signing anything after wine. William put the call on speaker. Tom, I need you awake. I am awake enough to bill you. This is serious. There was a pause. All right, talk. William glanced at Annie, then at the folder. I'm at the Sterling room, contract dinner, Ruiz, Moreau, Bellini. I remember the file. I have a problem with the translation. Diane stepped forward. He raised one hand. Tom, I'm going to send you photos of 3 sections. Spanish, French, Italian. I need a plain reading, not a negotiation reading. Plain. Thomas Reed's voice lost its sleep. Who translated them for you? William's eyes moved briefly to Diane. That's part of the problem. Diane's jaw tightened. William took photos of the marked pages and sent them. While they waited, the room seemed too small. Annie could hear the low hum of the ventilation and the faint noise of the dining room beyond the door. She pressed her hands together in her lap to stop them from trembling. Thomas came back after 2 minutes. William, yes. Do not sign this tonight. Diane's face went still. William leaned closer to the phone. Explain. The Spanish section transfers operational control of selected Hartman assets into Valterra Bridge Holdings upon execution. Not review, not escrow, transfer. The French section makes Hartman the principal party of record in the event of fraud claims or government inquiry. The Italian language gives Valterra the ability to freeze associated capital channels if Hartman challenges the transfer after signing. Annie let out a breath. William did not. So she was right. Thomas paused. Who is she? William looked at Annie. A waitress. Another pause. Well, Thomas said, give the waitress my thanks and nobody my signature. Diane stepped toward the phone. Mr. Reed, this is Diane Mercer. You are reviewing isolated provisions without the full commercial structure. These are standard mechanisms in international finance. Thomas answered calmly. Diane, I have been reading contracts since before you were choosing a major. If these are standard mechanisms, then a bear trap is standard furniture. Harold made a small choking sound and turned it into a cough. Diane's voice sharpened. With respect, you have not seen the negotiation history. With respect, I have seen enough not to let my client sign a document that makes him the cleanup crew for somebody else's fraud. William picked up the folder and turned to the page Annie had marked. Tom, have you heard of Valterra Bridge Holdings? I'll check now. Keyboard sounds came through the phone. Spell it. William did. Thomas was silent for a moment longer. Not much here. Registered address appears to be a shared corporate service location. Multiple linked entities. Panama filing. Cyprus branch. A Delaware shell with no staff. William, who brought this vehicle into the deal? William looked at Diane. Diane did not blink. The European side proposed it. That is not what you told me, William said. I told you they proposed an administrative structure. You told me Hartman retained oversight. We do through negotiated protections. Thomas said through the speaker. I do not see those protections in the pages you sent. Diane snapped. Because you do not have the whole document. Then send it. The room went quiet. William pushed the folder toward Diane. Yes, send it. Diane did not move. Annie watched her hands. They were calm on the surface, but one thumb rubbed slowly against the side of her index finger. A tiny movement. A nervous one. Annie had seen people do the same thing at eviction hearings, at clinic counters, at school offices when they knew a lie was almost finished. William saw it too. Diane, he said, send him the whole document. I don't have the final digital copy on me. William stared at her. You brought one printed contract to a signing dinner worth hundreds of millions and no digital final? The final came through secure transfer. Then access it. I would need my laptop. Where is it? At my hotel. Thomas spoke quietly from the phone. William, stop talking business in that room. Preserve the document. Photograph every page. Do not let anyone leave with it. Diane's eyes flashed. That sounds like an accusation. It is caution, Thomas said. You can decide how guilty it feels. William reached for the folder, but Diane placed her hand on it first. Annie's pulse jumped. Diane smiled, but the smile had no warmth. William, I think we should return to the table, apologize for the interruption, and reschedule with proper counsel. This has become emotional, Annie said. It became emotional when you called theft a partnership. Diane turned slowly. You should be very careful. William's voice hardened. Stop threatening her. I am not threatening anyone. Yes, Annie said, surprising herself. You are. Diane laughed under her breath. You think you matter now because he is listening for 5 minutes? Annie looked down at the folder, then back at her. No. I think you're scared because he finally is. Harold whispered. Oh, Lord. Again. William picked up his phone. Tom, stay on the line. Then he looked at Harold. I want copies of every page. Now. Use your office scanner. Harold nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Diane pulled the folder back an inch. This document is confidential. William placed his palm flat on top of it. It has my name on it, and their proprietary terms, and apparently a loaded gun pointed at my company. The two of them held the folder between them for one long second. Diane released it first. Harold took the folder as carefully as if it were made of glass and hurried out. Annie watched the door close behind him. Her chest loosened a little, but not much. Alejandro, Etienne, and Luca were still in the dining room. Diane was still standing 10 feet away, and Annie had just stepped into a world where people could ruin her life with phone calls she would never hear. William sat back. Annie. She straightened. Yes, sir? How do you speak all three? The question sounded less like suspicion now, more like something he should have asked before dismissing her. My mother worked at a clinic, Annie said. She helped patients fill out forms. A lot of people came in scared because they couldn't understand what they were being asked to sign. Spanish, French, Creole, sometimes Italian families from the old neighborhood. She taught me what she could. A woman next door, Mrs. Romano, helped with Italian. Spanish came from home, neighbors, buses, grocery stores. You hear enough when people think you're just standing there. William absorbed that. Thomas spoke from the phone. That's the best language school in America. Annie almost smiled. Diane did not. William leaned forward. Why did you say people with papers take everything? Annie's face changed before she could hide it. Because they do. That wasn't an answer. It's the only one I can afford to give right now. He did not press her, maybe because he had finally learned what happened when he pushed too fast. The door opened, and Harold returned without the folder. Copies are running. Mr. Hartman, Mr. Ruiz asked if everything is all right. What did you tell him? That you were reviewing language. And? He smiled. William's eyes narrowed. Of course he did. Harold swallowed. He also asked whether Miss Carter would be returning to the table. Diane's gaze snapped toward Harold. Annie felt cold move down her back. William stood. Did he say why? No, sir. Just asked. Thomas Reed's voice came through the speaker, low now. William, get the girl out of the restaurant after you preserve the pages. Diane said. That is absurd. No one is in danger. Annie looked at her. Then why do they care where I am? No one answered. From beyond the closed door, the sounds of dinner service continued. Soft and polished. But Annie understood something had changed again. At first, she had been a nuisance. Then a witness. Now, maybe, a problem to be solved. William looked at Harold. Lock the Madison room from the inside. Harold blinked. Sir? Lock it. Harold did. William turned to Annie. You're staying where I can see you. Diane folded her arms. And what am I? William looked at the door, then at the copied pages beginning to emerge somewhere down the hall, then at the interpreter he had trusted for 5 years. That, he said, is what I'm trying to find out. Harold turned the lock with hands that were not steady. The click sounded too small for what it meant, but everyone in the Madison room heard it. Annie stayed in her chair, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. William stood near the table with his phone still connected to Thomas Reed. Diane remained by the door, close enough to leave if the lock had not just been turned, close enough to Annie to make the room feel smaller. This is unnecessary, Diane said. William looked at her. A minute ago, you said no one was in danger. Now you're upset because I locked a door. I'm upset because you're letting fear make decisions. No, Thomas Reed said through the speaker. Fear kept him from signing. Pride almost did the opposite. Diane's eyes cut toward the phone. You are enjoying this. I enjoy preventing disasters. It's one of the few pleasures left in my profession. Annie almost smiled, but the fear in her stomach would not let it last. Somewhere outside that room, Alejandro Ruiz, Etienne Moreau, and Luca Bellini were still seated with wine in their glasses and no reason to panic yet. That worried her. Men who had nothing to hide demanded answers. Men who had plans waited for the next move. William turned to Harold. How long for the copies? 2, maybe 3 minutes. Harold said. The scanner is old. Of course it is. Harold swallowed. Mr. Hartman, I should say, the restaurant does not want any trouble with your guests. William gave him a look. Mr. Briggs, trouble is already sitting at my table. The question is whether your restaurant helped serve it. Harold opened his mouth, closed it, and wisely chose silence. Annie looked down at the table. She did not want Harold ruined. He was vain, nervous, and unfair. But she knew men like him. He spent his life pleasing people above him and correcting people below him. That did not make him innocent. It made him common. Diane noticed Annie's lowered eyes. You see, William, she understands the damage she's causing. Annie looked up. I understand damage. That's different. Diane folded her arms. Do you? Yes, ma'am. I understand when people use rules to make wrong things look clean. William studied Annie for a moment. You said your mother worked at a clinic. She did. Forms, patients, translations. Annie nodded. A community clinic on 71st. People came in with insurance letters, rent notices, medical bills, school papers. Sometimes they just needed someone to tell them what a page meant before they signed it. And she taught you? When she had time. Annie rubbed her thumb over her knuckle. She used to say a person shouldn't need a lawyer just to survive a sentence. Thomas Reed made a quiet sound through the phone. Your mother was right. Diane shifted, impatient. This is touching, but irrelevant. William turned to her. I don't think it is. Before Diane could respond, there was a knock at the door. Harold jumped. Who is it? William asked. A busboy's voice answered. Mr. Briggs, copies are done. William nodded to Harold. Open it, just enough. Harold unlocked the door and took a stack of warm pages through the gap. Annie saw the busboy's curious face for half a second before Harold shut and locked the door again. William held out his hand. Give them to me. Harold handed him the copies. William placed them beside the original folder and slid half the stack toward Annie. Diane moved immediately. She should not have those. William rested his hand on the pages. She is not leaving with them. She should not read them. She already read enough to save me from signing them. Diane's voice turned lower. You don't know that she saved you. Thomas spoke from the phone. I do. The room settled again. William tapped the first copied page. Annie, start where the trap starts. She took the pages carefully. The paper was still warm from the machine. Her eyes moved across the lines. First the English portions, then the attachments, then the small references at the bottom that pointed from one section to another like a trail through fog. It doesn't begin in one place, she said after a moment. That's why it works. William leaned forward. Explain. The main agreement sounds normal. Partnership, expansion, shared development rights. The dangerous parts are split up. Spanish section moves selected assets. French section puts responsibility under your name. Italian section lets them freeze money if you fight. Each piece looks technical by itself. Together, it's a cage. Harold whispered, A cage? Annie nodded. One you build around yourself by signing. William's face tightened. And Diane's role? Diane answered first. My role is to interpret language, which I have done faithfully for 5 years. Annie turned a page. Then why is your name here? Diane went still. William's eyes dropped to the paper. Where? Annie pointed. Here, authorized language witness, Diane Mercer. This says her English interpretation may be relied upon by all signing parties as the controlling explanation of foreign language attachments. William read the line once, then again. Controlling explanation? Thomas's voice sharpened. Send me that page. William took a photo and sent it. Diane said, That clause is administrative. Thomas replied after a few seconds. No, it is not. It makes Diane's explanation part of the reliance structure. If William later claims he misunderstood the attachments, they can argue he relied on his own interpreter's certified explanation. William turned slowly toward Diane. You made yourself my witness. I protected the process. You protected them from me. Diane's face hardened. You are tired. You are embarrassed. You are letting this girl turn you against the one person in the room who actually understands what is at stake. Annie said, She understands exactly what is at stake. That's why she wanted me gone. Diane stepped toward her. You need to stop speaking. William moved between them before Annie could answer. Not dramatically. Just one step. enough to change the shape of the room. Diane saw it and laughed without humor. "Are you protecting her now?" William did not answer at once. Maybe he did not know if he was. He looked at Annie, at the copied pages, at the locked door, at the phone where his lawyer waited in silence. Then he looked at Diane, the woman who had sat beside him in rooms from Geneva to Madrid, and turned every foreign word into something he could use. How many times had he nodded because she nodded? How many times had he signed because she said the language was clean? How many doors had he walked through because she told him there was no blade on the other side? 5 years, he said. Diane's expression softened at once. Yes, 5 years. That should mean something. It does. Then listen to me. I am. His voice dropped. That's the problem. A knock came again, harder this time. Harold looked ready to faint. Who is it? A man's voice answered, accented and smooth. Mr. Hartman? It is Alejandro. We are beginning to worry. No one moved. William looked at the door. I'll be out shortly. A pause. Is Miss Carter with you? Annie felt the room go cold around her. William's eyes flicked to her, then to Diane. Why do you ask? He called. Alejandro gave a soft laugh from the other side. Because Mr. Bellini wanted to apologize if our conversation was misunderstood. We do not want a young employee to feel uncomfortable. Diane closed her eyes briefly, as if annoyed by timing. Thomas Reed spoke quietly through the phone. Do not open that door. William said, tell Mr. Bellini he can apologize from his chair. Another pause. Alejandro's voice lost some of its warmth. Mr. Hartman, perhaps we should all sit together and clear this up like adults. William looked at Annie. Her hands were steady now, but her face was not. She had heard that tone before. Men making a threat sound like manners. No, William called. We'll clear it up with counsel. The silence outside the door lasted 2 seconds too long. Then footsteps moved away. Harold wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Diane spoke softly. You've insulted them. William turned back to the table. Good. Annie looked at him, surprised. He picked up the copied page with Diane's witness clause and placed it beside the Spanish transfer section, then the French liability section, then the Italian freeze clause. The pattern lay there in plain sight, no longer hidden by language, money, or polished dinner service. William took the pen from his jacket pocket. For one terrible second, Annie thought he meant to sign. Instead, he placed it on the table and pushed it away. I almost used that, he said. Nobody answered. His phone buzzed. Thomas had sent a message, then spoke through the speaker. William, I found another filing. Valterra Bridge Holdings has links to a Mercer Bridge Consulting registration in Delaware. I'm still confirming. But Diane, you may want to stop talking. Diane's face drained. William looked at her. Mercer Bridge? Diane said nothing. Annie turned one of the pages around and pointed to a small reference code near the bottom. That code appears 3 times. William leaned down. MBH. Mercer Bridge Holdings, Annie said. Thomas exhaled through the phone. Or close enough to ask a grand jury. Diane reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, then seemed to realize everyone had seen it. She straightened. This conversation is over. William's voice was quiet. No. It is finally beginning. Outside the Madison room, the restaurant kept serving dinner. Plates moved, glasses rang. Old couples ordered coffee, and the city shone beyond the windows as if nothing in the world had shifted. But at the round table under the soft wall lights, William Hartman looked at a waitress he had tried to dismiss 10 minutes earlier and saw the only person who had told him the truth all night. Annie, he said, how many more pages? She looked at the stack. Enough, she said, to make you very glad you went to the restroom. For the first time, Thomas Reed laughed through the phone. William did not. He gathered the pages, his face pale but clear. Then keep reading, he said, and this time, no one interrupts her. Annie kept reading. No one interrupted her at first. Diane stood near the wall with her arms folded, but she had stopped correcting every sentence. William noticed that more than he would have noticed another argument. Diane Mercer had built her career on words. Now, when words mattered most, she was choosing silence. Annie turned another copied page and ran her eyes over the French attachment. This one references a prior authorization. William leaned closer. Prior authorization from whom? It doesn't say your name directly. It says authorization from Hartman Development's designated representative. Diane spoke at once. That could mean any representative assigned to the European expansion. William did not look at her. Who was assigned? Diane's answer came half a second late. I coordinated the language side. That is not what I asked. Thomas Reed's voice came through the phone. William, ask whether there is a signature block. Annie had already found it. Her finger hovered above the lower corner of the page. There is. William followed her hand. The initials were small, placed near a clause most people would never read twice. Diane. William's face hardened. Diane Mercer. Diane straightened. Initialing receipt is not approval. Annie said, it says acknowledgement of authority. Diane turned toward her. You are reading words without understanding business practice. Then explain it, Annie said. The room went quiet again. William looked at Diane. Yes, explain it. Diane drew a measured breath. In international deals, language intermediaries often confirm that documents were exchanged and reviewed. That does not give me decision-making power. It does not mean I created the structure. It means I handled communication. Thomas Reed answered before William could. Then you won't mind if I compare that initialed page with the Delaware filing I'm looking at. Diane's eyes moved toward the phone. William caught it. Tom, he said. What filing? I am looking at Mercer Bridge Consulting LLC, registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Mailing address tied to a corporate services office. No employees listed. No public activity. But there is a cross-reference in a banking notice connected to Valterra Bridge Holdings. Diane's voice sharpened. That is privileged information. Thomas replied. No, Diane. It is public information. The sort of thing people forget is public, when they assume no one will check during dinner. Harold Briggs stood by the door, still holding the key, his shoulders drawn up as if he could make himself smaller. Mr. Hartman, should I call security? William looked at him. For whom? Harold regretted speaking. I only meant, if the situation becomes difficult. It already is difficult. I mean unsafe. Annie glanced toward the door. Maybe you should. Diane gave her a cold look. Still performing? Annie did not answer. The phone in William's hand buzzed. A text message appeared from an unknown number. He read it, and the muscles in his jaw tightened. Diane noticed. What is it? William turned the screen away. Interesting question. Thomas asked. William? William read aloud. Return to the table. Do not let the girl continue. This matter can still be profitable for everyone. Harold whispered, Jesus. Annie felt the blood leave her hands. Who sent that? No name, William said. Thomas's voice changed. Forward it to me. William did. Diane stepped closer. That could be from anyone. You cannot connect it to the men outside. I didn't say I did. No, but your face did. William looked at her. My face has learned a great deal tonight. For a moment, Diane seemed ready to say something honest. Then the mask returned. William, you are making a mistake. You are angry because you were embarrassed. I understand that. But if you turn this into a public accusation, your stockholders, your board, and every paper in Chicago will ask how a man of your experience nearly signed what you now claim is a fraudulent agreement. They will not blame me first. They will blame you. There it was. Not denial. Pressure. Annie watched William absorb it. Diane had aimed at the right place. Pride. Reputation. The fear. Older, powerful men. Carried like a second wallet. A poor person could be robbed and still have to go to work the next day. A rich man could be humiliated and mistake it for death. William said nothing. Diane softened her voice. Let me fix this. We go back to the table. We say there was confusion. We postpone signatures. Tomorrow, we handle it quietly, professionally. No police, no press, no waitress in the middle of something she cannot survive. Annie looked down. That last part was not entirely false. Thomas Reed broke the silence. William, listen to me. Quiet handling is how people bury evidence. Diane snapped. You are not here. No, Thomas said, but my client is, and apparently he's surrounded by people who wish I weren't awake. William looked at Annie. If I handle this quietly, what happens to you? Annie gave a small shrug. I get fired. Anything else? She did not answer. Annie. She looked toward the locked door. People like that don't just lose and walk away. They find another way to make you pay for making them look small. Harold swallowed again. Maybe we should move her through the service elevator. Diane laughed once. Now the restaurant is smuggling staff through back corridors? Mabel Johnson's voice came from outside before anyone could answer. If that staff is Annie, you better open this door. Harold looked startled. Mabel? Open it, Harold, before I use the master key and embarrass you in front of the Lord and everybody. For the first time all night, Annie's face loosened. It's okay. That's Mabel. William nodded to Harold. Harold unlocked the door. Mabel Johnson stepped in wearing a black kitchen apron dusted with flour, a dish towel thrown over one shoulder, and the expression of a woman who had raised children, trained cooks, buried friends, and feared very little that wore a suit. Her eyes found Annie first. You hurt? No, Mom. Scared? Annie hesitated. A little. Good. Means your brain is still working. Mabel looked at William next. You Mr. Hartman? I am. I don't know what kind of mess is happening in here, but two men from that fancy table just asked a busboy which door staff uses after closing. That seemed like something Annie might need to know. William turned to Harold. Which two? Harold looked ill. I don't know. I wasn't. Mabel cut him off. The Spanish one asked. The Italian one listened. Annie's stomach tightened. Diane said, This is becoming absurd. Mabel looked at her. Ma'am, I've been in kitchens 32 years. Absurd is when the fryer breaks on Mother's Day. This here is something else. Thomas Reed said through the phone. I like her. Mabel leaned toward the phone. And who are you? My name is Thomas Reed. I am trying to keep Mr. Hartman from ruining his life. Mabel nodded. Good. Keep at it. William picked up the copied pages and handed them to Thomas by sending another batch of photos. Then he turned to Harold. Call building security. Quietly. No announcement. No scene in the dining room yet. Harold nodded and hurried out. Diane moved toward the door. I should return to the table and calm them. William blocked her with one step. No, you cannot keep me here. I can ask you to stay while my lawyer reviews a document you translated. That is not an order I have to obey. No, William said, but leaving now would explain more than staying. Diane's mouth closed. Mabel moved to Annie's side and lowered her voice. Baby, tell me plain, are you in trouble? Annie glanced at William. He understood the look. She still did not trust him with her fear. He had earned that. Tell her, he said. Not me. Annie leaned toward Mabel. They were going to make him sign something bad. She changed what they said. I heard it. I told him. Now they know I heard. Mabel absorbed that without drama. All right. That was all. No panic. No questions meant to make Annie prove herself 3 times. Just all right. William saw the effect immediately. Annie's shoulders dropped a fraction, and he realized that trust did not always come from money, credentials, or time. Sometimes it came from being believed without being cross-examined. Thomas spoke again. William, I found something else. Everyone turned toward the phone. The Valterra documents have references to prior acquisitions in Chicago. Small property clusters. South Side mostly. A few commercial leases. Some residential buildings. Annie went still. William noticed. Annie? She reached for the nearest page. What addresses? Thomas read 2 aloud. Annie closed her eyes. Mabel's hand went to her back. What is it? The second one, Annie said. Her voice had changed. That was our building. William looked at her. Your building? Where my mother and I lived before we got pushed out. Diane said too quickly. That has nothing to do with tonight. Annie opened her eyes. They were wet, but her voice was steady. Then why is it in his contract? No one answered. Thomas said, William, this is no longer just a bad deal. This may be a pattern. William looked at the pages spread across the table. Spanish transfer, French liability, Italian freeze clause, Diane's witness language, Mercer Bridge, Valterra, South Side addresses. A pattern, a machine. And he had almost added his signature to it because the wine was good, the table was private, and the woman beside him had said the words were safe. He reached for his pen again. Diane watched him. Annie did too. William uncapped it, took one of the copied pages, and wrote across the top in large block letters, "Do not sign." Then he looked at Annie. "I owe you an apology," he said. Annie did not know what to do with that. Mabel did. "Start with thank you. Apology can come after you keep her safe." William accepted the correction without argument. "Thank you, Annie." Outside the room, a murmur rose near the dining area, then stopped. Harold returned with two men in dark suits from building security. William gathered the pages. "Now," he said, "we find out who at my table still wants to smile." William stepped out of the Madison room with the copied pages in one hand and his phone in the other. Mabel stayed close to Annie, not touching her, but near enough that Annie could feel the comfort of another body between her and the hallway. Diane walked behind them, her face controlled again, though the control looked thinner now, like glass held too close to heat. The two security men followed without speaking. The dining room had not stopped. That was what struck Annie first. People were still eating. A man near the windows was laughing at something on his phone. An older couple shared a slice of cheesecake. The bartender shook a cocktail behind the brass rail. The city outside went on shining, because cities did not pause when a life began to split open. At table 12, Alejandro Ruiz, Etienne Moreau, and Luca Bellini sat exactly where William had left them. Their plates had been cleared. Their wine glasses were not empty. Alejandro looked up first and smiled as if the last 20 minutes had been a minor inconvenience. "Mr. Hartman," he said, his accent warm, "we were beginning to wonder if Chicago had swallowed you." William did not sit. "Chicago has tried before." Luca gave a polite laugh. Etienne did not. His eyes moved to the papers in William's hand, then to Annie, then to the two security men waiting near the wall. Diane moved to her chair. "Gentlemen, there has been a misunderstanding." Mr. Hartman needed clarification on several language points. Alejandro's smile remained. "Of course, contracts can be dry creatures. Some creatures bite," William said. The smile weakened by a fraction. Harold Briggs hovered behind Annie, whispering, "Maybe we should move this back to the private room." William ignored him. "Mr. Ruiz, did you ask my staff where the employee exit is?" Alejandro lifted his eyebrows. "Employee exit?" Mabel spoke from behind Annie. "Don't do that." Every head turned to her. Alejandro's smile turned colder. "And you are?" "The woman who heard you ask." Luca raised his glass and took a sip. His hand was steady, but his eyes had stopped smiling. Etienne finally spoke. "This is becoming unpleasant." William looked at him. "You helped draft the French attachment?" "I reviewed language, yes." "Then you can explain why my company becomes the principal responsible party in the event of a fraud claim." Diane cut in. "William, this is not the place." "No," William said. "This is exactly the place. It is where you all asked me to sign." A few nearby tables had grown quiet. The piano player continued for 3 more notes. Notice the change, and let the music fade into the room's nervous hush. Alejandro set down his glass. "Mr. Hartman, perhaps our team should speak tomorrow. You wanted my signature tonight, because we believed there was trust." William looked at the documents. "That word is getting expensive." Etienne adjusted his glasses. "If your counsel has concerns, we can address them formally." "My counsel is on the phone." Thomas Reed's voice came from William's speaker. "Good evening, gentlemen." Luca's eyes flicked to Diane. Thomas continued. "I have reviewed portions of the agreement, the copied attachments, and the witness clause naming Miss Mercer. I have advised Mr. Hartman not to sign." Diane sat very still. Alejandro leaned back. "That is unfortunate. We have all invested time, and apparently a shell structure," Thomas said. Nobody at table 12 answered quickly enough. William placed one copied page on the table and tapped it with 2 fingers. "Valterra Bridge Holdings. Who controls it?" Alejandro looked at Etienne. Etienne looked at Diane. Diane looked nowhere. Luca took another sip of wine. Annie watched that sip. It made her angry in a way she had no room for earlier. He drank as if this were theater, as if she were part of the service, as if he could wait out truth the same way he waited for dessert. William noticed her expression. "Annie," she looked at him, "you heard them earlier. If they say anything now..." Translated. Diane turned sharply. "Absolutely not." William kept his eyes on the 3 men. "If you have nothing to hide, it should not matter who understands you." Luca smiled faintly and spoke in Italian, not loudly, but clear enough. This has become a circus. Annie answered before Diane could move. He said this has become a circus. Luca's mouth closed. Alejandro murmured in Spanish, "She is dangerous." Annie turned to William. "Mr. Ruiz said I'm dangerous." William looked at Alejandro. "She is a waitress." Alejandro did not answer. Etienne said in French, "Diane should have controlled this before it reached the room." Annie translated. "Mr. Moreau said Diane should have controlled this before it reached the room." Diane's face changed. "Etienne." The use of his first name told William plenty. Thomas Reed said, "Well, that was educational." Harold whispered, "I think I'm going to be sick." Mabel told him, "Do it quietly." William placed another copied page on the table. Mercer Bridge Consulting. Diane stood. "I will not be interrogated in a restaurant." "Sit down," William said. The room froze at the tone. It was not loud. It was worse. It was the voice of a man who had spent his adult life giving orders that people followed. Diane remained standing. "You are making a mistake. I made the mistake before dinner. I brought you." For the first time, pain crossed her face. It might have been real. That almost made it worse. "You trusted me for 5 years, she said. "Yes. I protected you." "From what? The truth?" Diane's hand tightened around the back of her chair. "You have no idea how many rooms I saved you in. How many times I caught what your lawyers missed. How many men laughed at you in their own languages until I turned their insults into something useful." William's eyes narrowed. "And tonight?" "Tonight was complicated." Annie said, "No. Tonight was clear." Diane turned toward her. "You should have stayed in the kitchen." Mabel stepped forward. "Try saying that to me instead." William raised a hand, not at Mabel, but to stop the room from breaking apart. "Diane, did you have any financial interest in Mercer Bridge Consulting?" Diane's answer came too late. "No," Thomas said. "That is not wise. I just found an incorporation contact with your office email." Diane's face drained. Alejandro stood slowly. "This meeting is over." One of the security men moved closer to the aisle. "No one is being detained," William said. "But if anyone leaves with original documents, I will treat it as destruction of evidence." Etienne looked at the folder. "Those are not your documents alone. They carry my name." Luca finally spoke in English. "Mr. Hartman, with respect, you are letting a servant turn dinner into an accusation." The word moved through the room like a slap. Annie did not flinch, but Mabel did. Not from fear, from anger. William looked at Luca for a long second. "Say that again." Luca seemed to realize the mistake. "I meant no offense." "Yes, you did," William said. "You meant all of it." Annie's throat tightened. She had heard worse. That was not what hurt. What hurt was how ordinary it sounded coming from him. William turned slightly toward her. "Translate what he said earlier, the line about the knife." Diane said, "William, Annie." Annie looked at Luca. "He said the old American wouldn't know the blade was in his own hand until he had already cut himself." A woman at a nearby table gasped softly. William's face held steady. "And you laughed?" Luca did not answer. Thomas spoke from the phone. "William, police should be notified. Not only building security. There are enough indicators here for attempted fraud." Harold looked alarmed. "Police? In the dining room?" Mabel turned to him. "You worried about the dining room or the crime?" Harold had no answer. Diane picked up her purse. "I am leaving." William stepped aside. "You can leave. Your purse stays until security checks it for company documents." Diane laughed in disbelief. "You cannot search my purse." "No," William said, "but police can." That stopped her. Alejandro spoke softly in Spanish. "We should have taken care of the girl downstairs." Annie heard every word. Her skin went cold. William saw her face change. What did he say? Annie did not speak at once. "Annie," he said, "quieter now." She looked at Alejandro, then at William. "He said they should have taken care of me downstairs." The nearest security man put a hand to his earpiece. Mabel moved close enough that her shoulder touched Annie's. William's eyes went flat. "Mr. Ruiz." Alejandro raised both hands. "A poor translation." Annie answered in Spanish, her voice steady enough to carry. "No, it was exact." For the first time, Alejandro stopped smiling. William lifted the phone. "Tom, call the police." "Already doing it," Thomas said. The dining room was fully quiet now. No one pretended not to listen. The people who had ignored Annie all evening were finally looking at her, not as staff, not as background, but as the reason a crime had failed before dessert. Diane lowered slowly back into her chair. William gathered the pages and kept the pen far from his hand. Then he looked at Annie, and there was no warmth in his face yet, only recognition. "You saved me from signing," he said. Annie answered honestly, "Not yet." His brow tightened. She looked at the folder, then at the three partners, then at Diane. "You stopped your hand. That's not the same as stopping them." The sirens were not audible yet, but everyone in the room seemed to hear them coming. The first siren did not come from outside. It came from Harold Briggs's phone. He had set it on vibrate, but in the frozen quiet of the Sterling room, the buzzing sounded loud enough to make half the dining room turn. Harold fumbled it from his pocket, looked at the screen, and whispered, "Building security." William kept his eyes on Alejandro. "Answer it." Harold pressed the phone to his ear. "Yes, yes, we're still in the dining room." "No, don't come through the main elevator with lights flashing. Use the service corridor." Mr. Hartman asked for quiet. Mabel snorted. "Little late for quiet." Annie stood near William's left side, still in uniform, still holding herself like a person who expected someone to tell her she had no right to be there. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to sit down. Sitting down felt too much like surrender. Alejandro had stopped smiling. Etienne kept both hands folded on the table, but his eyes moved too often toward the folder. Luca held his wine glass without drinking. Diane sat with her purse in her lap, her fingers resting on the clasp. William noticed. "Put the purse on the table." Diane looked up. "Excuse me?" "On the table. This is insulting. So was trying to sell me my own ruin with dinner." Her face tightened. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of." "I'm learning." Thomas Reed's voice came through the phone on speaker. "William, Chicago police are being contacted. I've also notified a financial crimes attorney I trust. Until officers arrive, preserve the original folder, the copies, and any devices used to transmit the contract." Diane gave a cold laugh. "You're turning a business disagreement into a criminal spectacle." Mabel crossed her arms. "Honey, when somebody says they should have taken care of a girl downstairs, that ain't business." Alejandro lifted his hands slightly. "That was misunderstood." Annie answered before anyone else could. "No, it wasn't." He looked at her for the first time with open dislike. "You are very confident." "No," Annie said. "I'm very sure." William glanced at her. There was a difference, and he heard it. Harold lowered his phone. "Security is coming through the staff entrance. 2 minutes." "Good," William said. "Nobody leaves." Etienne's voice was thin. "You do not have authority to detain us." "No," William said. "But I have authority to refuse to return your documents until police determine whether they are evidence. That folder contains proprietary materials. It contains my signature lines." Luca set his glass down. "This is madness." William looked at him. "You were much more relaxed when you thought I couldn't understand you." The room stirred. An older man at a nearby table leaned toward his wife and murmured something. She touched his arm, eyes fixed on Annie. A server stood by the bar with a tray of coffees cooling in his hand. The whole restaurant had become a witness, and none of them knew yet what kind. Diane slowly placed her purse on the table. William did not touch it. "Harold," he said, "ask security to keep it in sight until police arrive." Harold nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir." Diane looked at Annie. "You are going to regret this." Mabel stepped half a pace forward. "Say one more thing to that girl." Diane's eyes shifted to Mabel. "This does not concern you. She works in my kitchen. She works for the restaurant. She works with me," Mabel said. "There's a difference." Annie felt something loosen in her chest. Not safety. Not yet. But something near it. William picked up the copied pages again. "Annie, before officers arrive, I need you to mark the sections you translated. Only the sections you are certain about." Diane snapped. "She should not mark evidence." Thomas replied. "On copies, Diane. Try to keep up." For the first time that night, a few nervous laughs broke around the dining room. They died quickly, but Diane heard them. So did William. Harold brought a pen from the host stand. Annie took it, then paused. William noticed. "What is it?" "I don't want anyone saying I changed something," Thomas said. "Good instinct. Mr. Briggs, bring sticky notes instead. She can mark without writing on the pages." Harold rushed away. Annie looked toward the glass wall. Chicago lay beyond it, indifferent and bright. Somewhere down there, Jason was probably asleep with the TV on low, one sock half off, his school backpack on the floor. He had no idea his sister was standing in front of a billionaire, 3 foreign investors, a corrupt interpreter, and a room full of people who had finally stopped eating. William spoke quietly. "You have someone at home?" Annie turned. "My brother." "How old?" "Younger than me." "That isn't what I asked." "I know." He accepted that answer. "Does he know where you are?" "At work." "That's not what I asked either." This time Annie almost smiled. "No, sir." William looked at the door where building security had entered. "Then we keep this from following you home." Diane said, "You cannot promise that." William looked at her. "No. But I can start by not letting you walk out with a purse full of answers." Diane's face went pale with anger. "There is nothing in my purse." "Then waiting should be easy." Harold returned with sticky notes. Annie marked 3 pages first. The Spanish transfer clause, the French liability clause, the Italian freeze clause. Then she marked the witness language with Diane's name and the MBH reference code. Thomas stayed on the line, asking short questions. "Does the Spanish attachment refer to timing before or after execution?" "After," Annie said. "Does the French clause name Hartman as shared party or primary party?" "Primary." "Does the Italian section limit account freeze to project accounts?" "No. It says associated capital channels." "Good," Thomas said. "Clear and simple." Diane muttered. "She's being coached." Annie looked at her. "No, ma'am. I'm being asked." That landed harder than she expected. William turned his head, and for 1 second his expression showed something close to shame. Earlier, he had not asked. He had waved her away. 2 uniformed security officers approached the table. The taller one spoke to William first. "Mr. Hartman, sir, police are on their way. Mr. Briggs said there may be a threat." William pointed to Alejandro without raising his voice. That man made a statement in Spanish suggesting the employee should have been taken care of downstairs. She translated it. "I want him kept away from her. Alejandro Rose." "This is absurd." The security officer stepped closer. "Sir, please remain seated. I am a guest." "Then sit like one." Mabel made a small sound of approval. Luca pushed back his chair. "I need to make a call." "No calls," William said. "You cannot stop me." Thomas spoke from the phone. "Actually, the police may be interested in preserving communications from this point forward. I suggest everyone keep their hands visible, unless they want this evening to become more memorable." Luca cursed softly in Italian. Annie translated automatically. "He said this whole thing is damned." The room went still again. Luca looked at her. Annie did not apologize. Etienne reached into his jacket. One of the security men moved fast. "Hands out, sir." Etienne froze. "It is only my phone." "Then it can wait." The power in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. Not because Annie had become powerful in the way William was powerful. She did not own buildings. She could still be fired before midnight. Her rent was still due. But for this moment, every person at that table had to measure their words because she could understand them. William placed the marked pages into a neat stack. "Annie." "Yes, sir." "You said your family lost a building." She stiffened. "I said we got pushed out." "Because of papers?" "Because of papers nobody explained until it was too late." "Was Diane involved?" "I don't know." Diane answered too quickly. "Of course I wasn't." Annie looked at the MBH code. "Then why did your initials show up next to a company tied to the address?" Diane's face changed. William saw it. So did Thomas. So did Mabel. Before anyone could speak, the elevator doors opened across the dining room. 2 Chicago police officers stepped out with a third person behind them. A woman in a navy coat, short gray hair, badge clipped to her belt, eyes moving across the room faster than her feet. Harold whispered, "That's Detective Monroe." William looked at Thomas's voice coming from the phone. "You work fast." Thomas replied, "I work old. Old means I know who answers." Detective Grace Monroe reached the table and took in the scene. The folder, the marked pages, Diane's purse on the table, the 3 silent partners, William Hartman, standing beside a waitress, and the room full of diners pretending not to listen. "I'm Detective Monroe," she said. Someone want to tell me why a contract dinner has half a restaurant holding its breath? William looked at Annie. Annie looked at the pages. Then she looked at the detective and said, because they thought nobody serving water could understand them. Detective Grace Monroe did not smile at Annie's answer. She only nodded once, as if she had heard some version of that sentence many times before, and disliked every one of them. Start with names, she said. William stepped forward. William Hartman. I know who you are, Mr. Hartman. I still need you to say it for the report. William Hartman. Hartman Development Group. Detective Monroe turned to Annie. You? Annie Carter. Employee here? Yes, ma'am. Part-time server. Monroe's eyes moved to Mabel. Mabel Johnson, Mabel said. Kitchen supervisor. And I'm staying. The detective looked her over. Were you asked to leave? No. Then stay. Mabel gave a small nod, satisfied. Diane stood from her chair. Detective, I'm Diane Mercer, Mr. Hartman's interpreter. This is a business misunderstanding that has been inflated by confusion and emotion. I would strongly recommend counsel before anyone makes statements based on unverified translations from restaurant staff. Monroe turned to her slowly. I'll decide what I recommend in my own investigation, Miss Mercer. Diane's lips pressed together. The detective looked at the table. Who are the three gentlemen? William answered. Alejandro Ruiz, Etienne Moreau, Luca Bellini. International partners connected to the contract. Passports? The three men exchanged looks. Alejandro said, Detective, we are guests in this country and in this restaurant. We have done nothing except attend dinner. Monroe said, then showing identification should be the easiest part of your night. One of the uniformed officers stepped closer. The men produced passports and wallets with the stiff politeness of people who were used to private rooms, not police questions. Monroe handed the documents to the officer without taking her eyes off the table. Now, she said, somebody explain the paper. William placed the copied pages in front of her. I was prepared to sign this agreement tonight. Miss Mercer translated the terms differently from what they say. Annie overheard the conversations at the table in Spanish, French, and Italian. She warned me. My independent counsel reviewed portions of the contract and advised me not to sign. Monroe looked at Annie. You speak Spanish, French, and Italian? Yes, ma'am. Fluently? Annie hesitated. Enough to know what they said. That's not what I asked. Annie took a breath. Spanish, yes. French, mostly. Italian. Enough for conversation and reading. I'm not certified. Diane gave a quiet laugh. Exactly. Monroe looked at her. Miss Mercer, if you keep helping me dislike your timing, I'll start asking why. Diane went quiet. Thomas Reed's voice came through William's phone. Detective, this is Thomas Reed, counsel for Mr. Hartman. I'm available to provide the pages I reviewed and my notes. Monroe leaned toward the phone. Mr. Reed, are you recording this call? No. Start taking notes. Do not record unless everyone is advised. Understood. Monroe picked up the first marked page. Annie, tell me what this says. Slowly, Annie's mouth went dry. It was one thing to speak in front of William. It was another thing to speak in front of police, rich men, diners, and Diane Mercer's eyes. She looked at the page and forced herself to focus on the words. The Spanish clause says after signing, selected assets are transferred into Valterra Bridge Holdings for international administration. Monroe looked at William. Were you told that? No. I was told it concerned tax efficiency. The detective moved to the French page. This one? Annie read the French sentence aloud first, then translated it. If there is an investigation, civil claim, asset freeze, or government review, Hartman Development Group remains the main responsible party for statements before and after the agreement becomes active. Monroe's expression did not change. And you were told? William said, mutual accountability. The detective took the attenai, translated the account freeze language, keeping her voice steady until the last word. Monroe placed that sheet beside the others and tapped the witness clause. What is this? Thomas answered from the phone. A reliance clause. Miss Mercer's English explanations appear to be made legally significant. Diane said, appear. That is the important word. Monroe looked at her. Then we will let someone with a warrant find the important ones. Diane's face tightened again. Alejandro leaned forward. Detective, I must object. A young waitress overhearing private business conversation is hardly grounds for treating respected investors like criminals. Annie answered before she could stop herself. You weren't private when I was standing beside the table. Alejandro's eyes narrowed. You were serving water. Yes, Annie said. That doesn't mean I left my ears in the kitchen. A few guests nearby murmured. Monroe looked around once, and the room quieted. Luca spoke in Italian, low and bitter. This girl is making fools of all of us. Annie translated without looking at him. He said, I'm making fools of all of them. Monroe turned to Luca. You want to keep testing her? Or should I bring in a department translator and make this last until breakfast? Luca said nothing. Etienne adjusted his glasses. Detective, there is no signed agreement. No funds transferred. No crime completed. Thomas Reed replied. Attempted fraud exists, Mr. Moreau. Etienne glanced toward the phone. This is not your courtroom. No, Thomas said, but I've been in enough to recognize a man rehearsing. Monroe raised one hand. Enough, officer. Take the original folder into custody as voluntarily surrendered by Mr. Hartman unless he objects. I do not object, William said. Diane stood again. I do. That folder includes materials prepared for international counterparties. Monroe looked at her. Were they in your possession? They were brought for Mr. Hartman's review. Then Mr. Hartman can surrender them. Sit down. Diane did not sit. The detective's tone flattened. Miss Mercer. After a beat, Diane sat. The uniformed officer placed the original folder into an evidence bag. Annie watched the plastic seal close and felt something strange pass through her. Not relief. More like the moment after a storm warning, when the sky is still dark but somebody has finally admitted the storm is real. Monroe turned to Annie. Did anyone threaten you tonight? Annie looked at William, then Mabel. Mabel said quietly, Tell it. Annie nodded. Mr. Ruiz said in Spanish they should have taken care of me downstairs. Alejandro spread his hands. A poor translation. Monroe looked at Annie. Exact words? Annie repeated them in Spanish. Monroe turned to one officer. Write that down phonetically. We'll have it certified. Alejandro's face changed. This is absurd. Diane said, Detective, emotions are high. Words can be misunderstood across cultures. Mabel folded her arms. Threats translate real well. Monroe almost smiled, but not quite. William spoke for the first time in a while. Detective, two men from the table also asked about the staff exit. Mabel said, I heard that. Monroe turned to her. You'll give a statement? Gladly. Harold made a small noise. Monroe looked at him. You too, mister? Briggs, Harold Briggs, manager. You'll provide security footage. Harold's eyes darted toward Diane, then William, then the police. Of course. Now, Monroe said. Not after anyone has time to lose a file. Harold nodded. Yes, detective. Diane's purse still sat on the table. Monroe noticed it. Whose bag? Diane's hand moved toward it. Mine. Leave it there. Am I being detained? Not yet. I'm asking you not to touch potential evidence while I sort out whether you used devices or documents tonight in furtherance of attempted fraud. Diane's voice went cold. I want my attorney. That is the first sensible thing you've said. William looked at Diane, and for a moment Annie saw the damage beneath his anger. 5 years was a long time to trust the wrong person. Long enough for betrayal to feel like embarrassment before it felt like grief. Diane saw it too. She softened her voice. William, don't do this in public. We can still handle it quietly. He looked around the dining room, the guests, the staff, Mabel, Annie, the officers, the evidence bag. Then he looked back at Diane. That's the problem, he said. Too many things get handled quietly. Annie lowered her eyes. Detective Monroe heard the sentence and filed it away. Mr. Hartman, I'll need you at the station tonight, or first thing in the morning. Mr. Reed can coordinate. Miss Carter, I'll need your statement too. Annie's stomach dropped. Tonight? Mabel stepped closer. She's not going anywhere alone. Monroe nodded. I wasn't going to ask her to. William said, I'll arrange transportation. Annie looked at him. No offense, sir, but I'm not getting in your car. Mabel gave a small sound of approval. William accepted it. Fair. Monroe said, she can ride with me when the time comes. Before Annie could answer, Harold's phone buzzed again. He looked down and went pale. Monroe saw it. What? Harold swallowed. The rear service door alarm just opened. Mabel's head turned sharply. Kitchen door? Harold nodded. One of the security men spoke into his radio. Annie felt all the warmth leave her body. Diane's face was too still. William saw that too. Who went out? The radio crackled. A guard's voice came through, tense and breathless. Back corridor clear. Service exit propped open. No visual on who opened it. Monroe turned to the uniformed officers. Secure the exits. Alejandro, Etienne, and Luca sat silent. Too silent. Annie looked toward the hallway leading back to the kitchen. She thought of her coat hanging near the staff lockers. Her phone in the pocket. Her address in the employee file. Jason's text still unanswered from earlier. Mabel touched her arm. Stay close. William heard that and looked at Annie with a new understanding. The contract had been a trap for him, but Annie was the loose end. Detective Monroe said, "Nobody leaves this floor until I say so." Outside the windows, Chicago kept shining. Inside the Sterling room, every door had become a question. Detective Monroe moved first. Officer Lane, take the main elevator. Parker, service corridor. Building security covers stairwell access. Nobody opens a door without eyes on the other side. The officers responded and split off. The dining room, once full of quiet money and polished manners, had become a room of held breaths. Guests sat over cooling food. Servers stood by the bar with trays they no longer remembered picking up. Harold Briggs kept touching his tie as if straightening it could repair the evening. Annie stayed beside Mabel, but her mind had already run downstairs. Her coat was in the staff locker. Her phone was in that coat. Her phone had Jason's texts, Jason's number, their apartment address in old delivery messages, a photo of his school schedule. She had never thought of a phone as dangerous before. Now it felt like she had left her front door open. "My phone," she said. William turned. "What?" "My phone is in my coat. Staff locker. If somebody went through there..." Mabel's face changed. Her address might be on it. Monroe looked at Annie. "Is it locked?" "Yes, ma'am, but it's old. Sometimes it opens if you press too hard. I've been meaning to replace it." "That's not your fault." Monroe pointed to Harold. "Where are the staff lockers?" "Behind the kitchen, past dry storage." "Camera coverage?" Harold hesitated. Mabel answered for him. "Camera over the hallway. Not inside the locker room. Management says it's for privacy. Mostly it's because they don't want to pay for another camera." Harold gave her a wounded look. Mabel ignored him. Monroe keyed her radio. "Parker, check staff lockers behind kitchen. Possible phone and personal information compromised. Do not touch unless necessary. Report first." Annie hugged her arms around herself. She had faced Diane, translated 3 languages, and stood before police without crying. But the thought of Jason's name in the wrong hands nearly broke through her ribs. William saw it. "Your brother, Jason?" Annie looked at him sharply. "You mentioned him earlier," he said. "Not his age. His name was on your phone when you were at the service station. I saw it when I walked in. I'm sorry." She did not know whether to be upset or relieved that he remembered. "Someone should go to him," William said. Annie shook her head. "No. He'll panic if a stranger knocks. Can you call him? My phone's back there." William offered his. "Use mine." Annie stared at the expensive phone in his hand as if it belonged to another species. Mabel nudged her. "Call the boy." Annie took it. Her fingers trembled as she dialed Jason's number from memory. It rang twice. "Hello?" Jason sounded half asleep and suspicious. "It's me," Annie said. "Why are you calling from some weird number?" "Because my phone's at work." "Listen to me. Lock the door, leave the chain on, and don't open for anybody. Not even someone saying they're from the building." He woke up in her ear. "What happened?" "Nothing you need to handle." "That means something happened." "Jason." "Annie." She closed her eyes. He sounded too young and too grown at once. "I'm okay. Police are here. Mabel's with me." "Police?" Mabel leaned close to the phone. "Boy, this is Miss Mabel. Your sister is standing right here. She is not hurt. Do what she says, and don't make me come over there after midnight." A pause. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Annie took the phone back. "I'll call again soon. Lock everything." "I love you," Jason said quickly, like he was embarrassed by fear. Annie's voice softened. "Love you too." She ended the call and handed the phone back to William. Thank you. He nodded once. Detective, I can send someone to watch the building. Discreetly, Monroe looked at him. No private men. Not yet. I'll request a patrol car to pass by and park nearby. Address? Annie hesitated. Monroe noticed. You can write it down. You don't have to say it out loud. Mabel found a server pad from a nearby station and handed it to Annie. Annie wrote the address and gave it to the detective. Monroe folded the paper without reading it aloud and passed it to one officer with instructions. Diane watched all of this with a strange expression, somewhere between irritation and calculation. William noticed. Why are you looking at her like that? Diane blinked. Like what? Like you're measuring how much trouble she creates. She has created plenty. Annie said. No, I found it. Mabel murmured. That's right. The radio crackled. Officer Parker's voice came through. Detective. Staff locker area checked. One locker. Open. Black winter coat on bench. Phone missing. Annie's stomach dropped. Monroe's face hardened. Any sign of forced entry? Locker door looks bent. Could have been pried. Also found a service door wedge on the floor nearby. Mabel swore under her breath. Harold said, We have never had this kind of incident at the Sterling Room. Mabel turned on him. Harold, if you say one more thing about the restaurant's reputation while that girl's life is being pulled apart, I will put your head in the soup pot. Harold closed his mouth. William looked at Diane. Did you send someone to the lockers? No. Did you tell anyone her name? Diane laughed, but it sounded thin. Everyone here can read her name tag. Did you tell anyone to find her information? No. Monroe stepped closer to Diane. I'll need your phone. Diane's spine straightened. I want my attorney. You can have your attorney. I'm asking for consent. Denied. Monroe nodded, unsurprised. Then don't touch it. Diane slowly removed her hand from the side of her purse. William turned to Alejandro. Did you send someone? Alejandro's expression remained controlled. I do not know this girl. I do not care where she lives. Annie translated the Spanish insult he added under his breath before he could stop her. He said people like me always think we matter when trouble starts. Alejandro looked at her with open anger. Monroe pointed to him. One more comment in any language and I separate you from the table. Luca muttered. This is why loose ends should be cut early. Annie heard it in Italian. She did not translate right away. William saw her freeze. What? She looked at Luca. He said loose ends should be cut early. This time the reaction came from the room. A woman near the window put a hand to her mouth. One of the servers whispered, Oh my God. The taller security guard moved closer to Luca. Luca smiled with no humor. Idiom. Thomas Reed's voice came through the phone. That's an idiom people use right before a prosecutor becomes interested. Monroe spoke to both officers. Separate them. Now. Alejandro stood. We are not criminals. No, Monroe said. You are persons of interest who keep saying threatening things in front of the one person who understands you. The officers moved them to separate tables within sight, each watched by security. Etienne went quietly. Alejandro complained. Luca tried to make a call and lost the phone from his hand before he completed the first swipe. Diane remained seated, but the distance between her and the others made her look less like an interpreter and more like the center thread in a knot beginning to pull apart. Officer Parker returned from the service corridor holding an evidence bag. Inside was Annie's phone. Screen cracked. Annie stepped forward. That's mine. Found it in the trash near the rear exit, Parker said. Still powered on. Monroe took the bag. Do not unlock it yet. Annie, do you use cloud backup? I think so. My brother set it up. William said, if messages were opened, can we tell? Thomas answered, possibly. But first, preserve the device. Monroe nodded. We will. Annie felt the room tilt. She gripped the back of a chair. William moved as if to help, then stopped himself. He seemed to understand she might not want his hand on her. Mabel did it instead. Breathe, baby. I'm fine. No, you're upright. That's different. Annie breathed. Diane watched Mabel hold Annie steady and seemed almost offended by it. Monroe turned back to William. Mr. Hartman, this has moved beyond contract review. I'm treating this as attempted fraud with possible witness intimidation. I need statements from you. Miss Carter, Miss Johnson, Mr. Briggs, and anyone who heard the remarks. Mr. Reed can meet us at the station. William nodded. Done. Annie looked toward the kitchen hallway. Am I going to lose my job? Harold opened his mouth. Mabel pointed at him without looking. Think carefully. Harold swallowed. No, Annie. Of course not. Annie almost laughed. Nothing about of course belonged in that sentence. William looked at Harold. She is paid for the full shift. Overtime if this keeps her here. Harold nodded. Yes, sir. Annie bristled. I don't need. Mabel squeezed her arm. Take the money. Pride don't pay gas. William heard that and did not argue. Monroe started gathering the marked copies. Who first noticed the mistranslation? Annie answered. I did. And who first dismissed it? The question hung there. William did not let anyone else answer. I did, he said. Annie looked at him. He kept his gaze on Detective Monroe. She tried to warn me at the table. I waved her away. She followed me to the hallway because I was about to go back and sign. I was rude. I was wrong. Put that in the report. Diane looked at him like he had committed a worse betrayal than any contract fraud. He had admitted fault in public. Monroe wrote it down. Annie did not thank him. Not yet. But something in her face changed, and William saw it. From across the room, Alejandro said something to the officer in Spanish, too low for most to catch. Annie caught it. Monroe saw her reaction. What now? Annie's voice was quiet. He said this isn't over. William turned toward Alejandro. Mabel stood straighter. Monroe closed her notebook. No, she said. It isn't. But now it's not just his choice. Detective Monroe did not let Alejandro's last sentence sit in the room for long. Officer Lane, she said. Mr. Ruiz can wait by the bar with you. Mr. Bellini stays near the window with Parker. Mr. Moreau remains at table 8. No phones. No private conversations. If any of them need water, give them water. If they need a lawyer, they can ask out loud. Luca's mouth tightened. Are we prisoners now? No, Monroe said. Your men who keep speaking like threats are punctuation. Mabel gave a small nod. That part. William stood near Annie, but not too close. He seemed to have learned in the last half hour that protection could feel like pressure when it came from the wrong direction. Annie noticed that and hated that she noticed. It was easier when he was only arrogant. Arrogant men could be ignored. A man trying to do better was harder to place. Harold approached with the nervous courage of someone who had just remembered he had a job title. Detective, I have the security footage from the hallway queued in my office. I can show you the rear service corridor. Monroe looked at Annie. Can you walk? Annie nodded. Yes, ma'am. Mabel said, she can walk. Doesn't mean she should walk alone. Then come with us. William picked up the copied pages. Monroe stopped him with one look. Those stay with Officer Lane. William handed them over. I want copies. You'll get them through your lawyer. Thomas Reed, still on speaker, said, I heard that and approve against my client's instincts. William looked at his phone. Tom, meet us at the station. I'm already getting dressed. At my age, that's an act of loyalty. Monroe ended the call only after Thomas gave her his direct number. Then she led Annie, Mabel, Harold, and William toward the rear corridor. Diane remained in the dining room with one officer nearby, her purse still on the table, her face unreadable. As Annie passed, Diane spoke low enough that only she could hear. You should have stayed quiet. Annie stopped. Mabel stopped with her. William turned back. Annie looked at Diane. That would have made your night easier. Diane's eyes narrowed. And yours safer. Monroe stepped between them before Mabel could. Miss Mercer, save your energy for your attorney. Diane sat back, but her gaze followed Annie all the way to the kitchen doors. Behind those doors, the Sterling room changed. The gold light vanished, replaced by stainless steel, white tile, steam, fryer smell, and the fast, tired rhythm of working people. A dishwasher shut off the sprayer when he saw the detective. A line cook held a pan in midair. Someone whispered Annie's name. Mabel lifted her chin. Back to work unless the law asks you something. The kitchen moved again, but softer now. Harold led them past dry storage to a small office with a computer monitor and 3 mismatched chairs. The room smelled of printer toner and burnt coffee. On the wall hung staff schedules, health inspection notices, and a faded poster reminding employees to smile because hospitality begins with attitude. Mabel saw Annie looking at it. Don't start. Annie almost smiled. Harold clicked through the security system. His hands were still shaking, and twice he opened the wrong file. "Harold," Monroe said, "slow down." "I'm trying." "Try slower." He swallowed and found the rear hallway feed. The footage showed a narrow corridor outside the locker room. Time stamped 8:42 p.m. Annie saw herself earlier in the shift, walking past with a tray, a busboy, a bartender. Then, at 9:31, not long after everything broke open in the dining room, a man in a dark jacket entered the frame. Annie leaned closer. "That's not kitchen staff," Mabel said. "No. And he walks like he knows he ain't supposed to be there." The man kept his head angled away from the camera. He wore black gloves. He moved to the locker room door and disappeared inside. Less than a minute later, he came out with something small in his hand. "My phone," Annie said. William's voice was flat. "Can you zoom in?" Harold tried. The image blurred, then sharpened enough to show the man's profile for 1 second as he looked toward the service exit. Monroe pointed. "Freeze." Harold froze the image. William took 1 step closer. "I've seen him." Annie looked at him. "Where?" "At the table, not sitting with them. Behind Luca when they arrived. I thought he was a driver." Harold snapped his fingers. "Yes, he came up with the party. I remember because he asked if there was a separate place for chauffeurs to wait. I told him ground level." Monroe wrote it down. "Name?" Harold shook his head. "I don't have one." William's face hardened. "Luca will." Mabel folded her arms. "That man went into a staff locker room, took a young woman's phone, and went out the back." "That sounds like a whole lot more than a misunderstanding." Monroe nodded. "It does." The footage continued. The man propped open the service door with a rubber wedge, checked his phone, then left the frame. A minute later, Officer Parker appeared in the hallway from the opposite direction. Too late. Annie felt sick. "He had time to look through it," she said. Monroe turned to her. "Maybe, maybe not. We'll have tech check access times. My brother's number is in there. We have a patrol unit near your building now. I'll confirm." Monroe stepped into the hallway and made the call. Annie stayed in the office with Mabel, Harold, and William. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Harold said, "Annie, I need to apologize." Mabel looked at him. "Careful. First words matter." Harold's face flushed. "I should have listened when you said something was wrong." Annie looked at him. "You didn't even ask what I heard." "I know. You just saw a server making a problem." He lowered his eyes. "Yes." That simple answer did more than a long excuse would have. Annie nodded once. "Okay," Mabel said. "That is not forgiveness, Harold. That is her not having time to raise you tonight." Harold accepted the blow. William stood with his hands at his sides. In the kitchen light, without the table, wine, and skyline around him, he looked less untouchable. Still rich, still powerful, but also like a man who had discovered that power did not make him the smartest person in every room. "You said your family was pushed out because of papers," he said quietly. Annie looked tired. "This really isn't the time." "No, it probably isn't, but it may be connected." She did not answer. He continued, carefully. "If Valterra or Mercer Bridge touched your old building, I need to know." "You need?" He heard the edge in her voice and stopped. Annie looked at him fully. "That's the thing about men like you. Even when you're trying to help, it starts with what you need." Mabel looked between them and said nothing. William took the correction. "You're right." That surprised Annie more than denial would have. He tried again. "If you choose to tell me, I will listen." Annie studied him. "My mother signed a relocation agreement. She thought it meant temporary housing until repairs were done. The English was one thing. The explanation was another. By the time she found out, the building had been sold, and we had 30 days. She tried to fight it. Nobody returned her calls." William's face darkened. "When?" 6 years ago." "Building address?" She did not answer right away. Then Monroe returned. "Patrol is outside your building," the detective said to Annie. "Your brother is safe. Annoyed, but safe." He asked if he could order pizza because he was under police protection. Annie covered her mouth, half laugh, half sob. "That sounds like him." Mabel patted her shoulder. "That boy will live." Monroe looked at William. "The man on the footage came in with Bellini's party. We're going to question him separately about identity. I also want the staff entrance sealed and the elevator logs pulled." Harold nodded. "I'll get them," William said. "Detective, Annie mentioned a relocation agreement tied to her old building. Thomas found Southside addresses connected to Valterra. This may not be the first attempt. Monroe looked at Annie, not William. Do you want to talk about that tonight? Annie appreciated the question more than she expected. Not in front of everybody, she said. Fair. A sharp knock came from the kitchen entrance. One of the security men stepped in. Detective, Miss Mercer is asking to leave. Says her attorney told her not to answer questions. Monroe's expression did not change. She can stop answering. She cannot take her purse until we determine whether it contains evidence, unless she wants to wait for a warrant and a longer night. She's angry, Mabel said. Join the club. The security man added, also, Mr. Bellini is asking for his driver. William looked at the frozen image on the monitor. I bet he is. Monroe pointed at the screen. Print that still. Harold moved to the keyboard. Annie watched the printer begin to hum. A grainy image slid out slowly. A man with his face half turned. A stolen phone in one gloved hand. The service door ahead of him. A small picture. A small proof. Her mother used to say proof mattered because truth without proof had to beg. Tonight, for once, truth had something in its hand. Monroe took the printout. Now we go back. Annie's stomach tightened again. To the dining room? Yes, Monroe said. Because Mr. Bellini has a driver to identify. William stepped aside to let Annie pass first. She noticed. So did Mabel. They walked back through the kitchen, past the line cooks, past the dishwashers, past the swinging doors. This time, when Annie entered the dining room, people did not look through her. They made room. When Annie stepped back into the dining room, the first thing she saw was Diane Mercer's purse still sitting on the table where Detective Monroe had left it. Diane sat beside it with both hands folded in her lap, calm on the outside and burning underneath. Alejandro was at the bar with Officer Lane standing near him. Etienne sat alone at table 8, his posture stiff, his wine untouched. Luca stood by the window with Parker between him and the elevator, looking less charming now that no one was laughing with him. Detective Monroe held up the printed still from the security footage. Mr. Bellini. Luca turned. Yes? Is this man connected to your party? He glanced at the paper for less than a second. No. William stepped closer. Look again. I looked. Monroe placed the printout on the table in front of him. Take your time. Luca did not touch it. I said no. Annie looked at the photograph. The man's face was partly turned, but she could see the line of his jaw, the black jacket, the gloved hand holding her phone. She remembered him now, not clearly from tonight, but from the elevator area when William had arrived. He had stood behind Luca, not speaking, looking at the staff doors before he looked at the skyline. He came in with you, Annie said. Luca's eyes moved to her. You seem to see many things. I was working, she said. That's what working people do. We notice what needs doing and who's in the way. Mabel made a low, approving sound. Detective Monroe looked at Luca. Name. I do not know him. Officer Parker spoke from the window. Sir, earlier you asked for your driver. Luca's face tightened. I have many drivers when I travel. Then this should be simple. Give us the name of tonight's. I would need to check. No phone, Monroe said. Say it from memory. Luca's silence stretched. Alejandro called from the bar. Luca. Say nothing. Annie translated automatically, then stopped herself. It had been in Spanish, but everyone understood the tone. Monroe turned toward Alejandro. Mr. Ruiz, I don't need translation for obstruction. Alejandro raised both hands. I am only reminding my associate of his rights. You can remind yourself next. Diane stood. Detective, this is becoming harassment. Mr. Bellini is a foreign national, and you are pressing him in a public dining room based on a blurry image and the word of a server who has already inserted herself into confidential business. Annie felt the old sting behind the word server, but this time it did not push her backward. She was tired of being described as if the job made her less able to hear. Monroe looked at Diane. Miss Mercer, sit down. I will not be ordered around like a suspect. Then stop acting like one. A few guests shifted. Someone near the bar whispered, good for her, and then pretended to study the dessert menu. Diane heard it. Her face did not change, but Annie saw her fingers curl. William spoke quietly. Diane, you have said enough. No, William. I have said too little. She turned on him, and for the first time that night her voice carried past the table. You are letting this girl humiliate you because you are afraid to admit you do not understand the world you keep buying pieces of. The room went still again. William did not answer at once. Diane continued, each word sharper than the last. You think men like Ruiz, Moreau, and Bellini respected you because they smiled? They respected access. They respected your money. They respected the fact that I made you sound less lost than you were. Mabel muttered, there she is. William looked at Diane with a strange calm. Is that what you thought of me for 5 years? Diane gave a short laugh. I thought you were useful. Annie saw the sentence hit him. He covered it well, but not fully. The shoulders stayed square. The face stayed controlled. But something behind his eyes shifted from anger to something older and more private. Detective Monroe stepped in. Miss Mercer, I'm going to advise you to stop talking until your attorney arrives. Diane ignored her. Her attention was on William now. You want to pretend this is betrayal because it makes you noble. It is business. Everyone takes what they can. The only difference tonight is that your waitress overheard the wrong language. Annie's stomach tightened. William's voice dropped. Her name is Annie. Diane turned toward her. Yes, Annie, the brave little waitress who thinks truth will protect her. She leaned slightly over the table. Do you know what happens after tonight? Reporters may clap for you. Police may take your statement. Mr. Hartman may even pay you for your trouble. Then everyone goes home. And you still live where you live. You still work shifts. You still have a brother whose name was in your phone. Mabel stepped forward fast. William moved too, but Monroe raised a hand and stopped them both. Annie went cold. Diane smiled without warmth. Careful, Annie. Some doors stay open once opened. Monroe's face hardened. That is a threat. Diane sat back. It is an observation. No, Annie said. Everyone looked at her. Her voice was low at first. No, it's a threat, and you said it because you think saying it nicely makes it different. Diane's eyes narrowed. Annie continued, and the room heard every word. You said I should have stayed quiet. You said no one would believe a poor black girl in a waitress uniform over an interpreter who sits beside billionaires. You said people like me survive by staying quiet. William's head turned sharply. She said that? Annie nodded. Mabel looked at Diane like she wanted 10 seconds alone with her in the walk-in freezer. Diane's face stilled. I said no such thing. Annie reached into the pocket of her apron, then remembered her phone was in an evidence bag. The small hope broke before it formed. Diane noticed and smiled. Then Mabel reached into her own apron pocket and pulled out a phone with a cracked red case. Funny thing about kitchens, she said. There's always another phone. Annie turned. Mabel? Mabel did not look at her. She looked at Monroe. When I came to the Madison room door earlier, I heard raised voices before Harold opened up. After that, I kept this running. Old habit. Had a cousin lose a job once because nobody believed what a manager said when customers weren't around. Diane's face drained. Monroe held out her hand. May I? Mabel handed her the phone. You may. Diane stood. That is illegal. Thomas Reed's voice was no longer on speaker, but William had called him back on mute and held the phone near the table. His voice came through faintly after William unmuted him. Illinois has specific rules on recording. Detective can sort admissibility later. But for immediate investigative purposes, that is very useful. Monroe tapped the screen. Mabel showed her the file. The audio crackled at first, then Diane's voice came out clear enough for every person at table 12 to hear. You should have stayed quiet. Then Annie's voice, smaller. That would have made your night easier. And Diane again. And yours safer. The room did not gasp this time. It simply absorbed the words. There are moments when people do not react because the truth is too plain to decorate. Monroe stopped the recording. Miss Mercer, I'm going to ask you to stand and keep your hands visible. Diane did not move. Officer Lane came from the bar. Alejandro spoke in Spanish, too fast and angry. Do not let them take the phone, Annie translated. He said don't let them take the phone. Lane turned back toward Alejandro. Sir, sit down. Alejandro did not sit. At the same time, Luca moved his hand toward his jacket. Parker caught his wrist before it reached the inside pocket. Etienne stood abruptly from table 8, knocking his chair back. The dining room broke into motion. Guests pushed away from tables. A glass fell and shattered. Harold backed into a server carrying coffee. Mabel grabbed Annie by the arm and pulled her behind her. "Stay behind me." William moved between Annie and the table without thinking. Luca cursed in Italian as Parker twisted his arm behind his back. Annie did not translate. She did not need to. Lane forced Alejandro back onto the bar stool. Etienne raised both hands, saying, "I am only standing," while another security guard stepped in front of him. Diane finally stood, but not because she was surrendering. Her eyes went to the elevator. Monroe saw it. "Don't." Diane froze. "Purse stays. Phone stays. You stay." Diane looked around the room, and Annie saw the calculation end. There was no quiet exit now. No soft explanation. No professional misunderstanding. Too many people had heard too much. Monroe turned to Annie. "You all right?" Annie wanted to say yes. The automatic answer rose to her mouth, old and easy, but Mabel's hand was on her arm. And William Hartman, of all people, was standing in front of her like he had finally understood the shape of danger. "No," Annie said, "but I'm standing." Mabel squeezed her arm. "That'll do for now." Monroe nodded to the officers. "Separate statements. Preserve the recording. Collect the purse pending warrant review. And get Mr. Bellini's jacket searched once we have legal clearance. Nobody touches anything without logging it." William looked at Diane. "You used my trust to build a weapon against me." Diane's voice came out thin. "You would have signed anything if I had smiled." He looked at the pen still lying near his place setting. "Maybe," he said. "That is the part I have to live with." Then he turned to Annie. "I didn't believe you." "No," she said. "I waved you away." "Yes. I am sorry." Annie studied him for a moment. She did not forgive him. Not yet. An apology given during a fire had to survive after the smoke cleared. "Then don't waste what I said," she replied. William nodded once. Detective Monroe picked up Mabel's phone, now sealed in an evidence sleeve, and looked toward the service corridor. "Miss Carter, Miss Johnson, you're coming with me. Mr. Hartman, you too. We'll take statements where no one is drinking a $200 bottle of wine." Harold whispered, "300. Mabel looked at him. He lowered his eyes. "Sorry." As officers began moving the men apart, Annie glanced toward the window. Chicago shone beyond the glass, the same as before. But inside the Sterling room, the invisible lines had shifted. The people who used to speak freely around her had gone silent. For the first time all night, Annie did not have to ask them to listen. The station smelled of burnt coffee, floor cleaner, and long nights. Annie sat in a small interview room with Mabel beside her and Detective Monroe across the table. A recorder sat between them, red light steady. It was not hidden. Monroe had explained it twice before turning it on, then asked Annie if she understood. Annie said yes, though she was not sure she understood anything about how a dinner shift had become evidence. William was in another room with Thomas Reed, who had arrived wearing a wrinkled suit, no tie, and the expression of a man who had been dragged out of bed by disaster and decided to build disaster by the hour. Harold was down the hall giving a statement about the rear service door. Diane Mercer had stopped speaking entirely after her attorney arrived. Alejandro, Etienne, and Luca had been separated, their phones taken pending warrants, their confidence reduced to careful silence. Monroe opened a notebook. "Annie, we've covered the restaurant. I want to go back to your old building, but only if you're ready." Mabel looked at her. "You don't have to perform strength for anybody." Annie nodded. "I know," but she did not know how to separate readiness from fear. Most of her life had taught her that readiness simply meant moving before the choice disappeared. She folded her hands on the table. "Ask." Monroe's voice softened, not enough to pity her, just enough to make the room less sharp. "You said your mother signed a relocation agreement 6 years ago." "Yes." "What was her name?" "Elaine Carter." "Address?" Annie gave it. Monroe wrote it down. "What did your mother believe she was signing?" "That repairs were being done. Mold, pipes, wiring. The landlord sent people door to door with forms. They said families would move temporarily, then come back after the building passed inspection." "Who explained the forms?" Annie swallowed. "A woman. White. Brown hair. Expensive coat. I remember the coat because it was raining, and she kept acting like the building was dirty for touching it." Monroe wrote without looking up. "Name?" "I didn't know then," my mother asked. The woman said, "Diane from the redevelopment office." Mabel went still. Monroe's pen paused. Diane? Annie nodded. I didn't connect it tonight at first. 6 years is a long time. And I was younger. But when Thomas said Mercer Bridge, and then when I heard Diane talk to me, she stopped. The words scraped coming out. It was the same voice when she got impatient. Mabel's hand covered Annie's for a second. Take your time. Annie looked at the recorder. My mother asked if we could come back. Diane said yes. If we complied with the relocation timeline and didn't create delays. She said the repairs were for resident safety. My mother signed because Jason had asthma, and the mold was making him worse. Monroe's face changed by almost nothing, but Annie saw it. Some details do not need drama to become heavy. What happened after that? Monroe asked. We got moved to a motel near Cicero first, then a smaller apartment. Then the checks stopped. My mother called the number on the packet. Disconnected. She went back to the old building. It was fenced off. 2 months later, there was a sign about luxury units coming soon. We never went back. Mabel muttered, Lord have mercy. Annie looked down. My mother kept the folder. She kept everything. Rent receipts, letters, names, all of it. Monroe leaned forward. Where is it now? At home, in a blue plastic bin under her bed. Your mother still lives with you? Annie's face tightened. Mabel answered quietly. Elaine passed 3 years ago. Monroe looked at Annie. I'm sorry. Annie nodded once. She did not want the room to become about grief. Grief was too large, and tonight only had room for facts. She died thinking she had missed something, Annie said. That was the worst part. Not just losing the apartment. She kept saying, I should have read it better. But she did read it. The problem was what they told her it meant. Monroe turned a page. Annie, would you be willing to let us review that folder? Yes. Not tonight without you. I can arrange for an officer and a victim advocate to accompany you, or we can get it tomorrow. Annie shook her head. Tonight. Mabel looked at her. Baby, you're exhausted. I know where it is. If someone already took my phone, I don't want that folder sitting there. Monroe nodded. That's reasonable. There was a knock. Monroe opened the door, and William Hartman stood outside with Thomas Reed behind him. William looked tired in a way money could not hide. Detective, he said. Tom found something. Monroe stepped into the hall. Annie could still hear them through the open door. Thomas spoke first. Mercer Bridge Consulting had a subcontract with a redevelopment advisory firm tied to 3 South Side properties, including the address Annie gave. The dates line up. Diane's name doesn't appear on the public-facing paperwork, but an email domain tied to her firm does. Monroe looked back at Annie. You heard that? Annie nodded. William's jaw worked once. I'm sorry. Annie looked at him. You didn't take our building. No, he said. But my company bought into portfolios like that. Maybe not yours. Maybe yes. I didn't ask enough questions because the returns looked clean. Mabel stood. Don't you dare make this girl carry your confession tonight. William looked at Mabel, then lowered his eyes. You're right. Thomas cleared his throat. For once, William, silence is available at no extra charge. Monroe almost smiled. Mr. Hartman, I need you to give this information formally. I will. Annie stood. I want the folder from home. Monroe looked at the clock. All right. We go with you. William said, I can send a car. Annie turned to him. No. He nodded. Understood. Mabel picked up her coat from the chair. She rides with me or the detective. With me, Monroe said. Miss Johnson can follow or come along. I'm coming along, Mabel said. Harold can close his own restaurant for once. The ride to Annie's apartment was quiet. Monroe drove. Annie sat in the back with Mabel, watching the city slide past the window in broken patches of streetlight, late buses, closed storefronts, and people walking fast with their collars up. Chicago looked different after midnight, less like a postcard and more like a ledger of who had somewhere warm to go. When they reached the building, a patrol car sat across the street. Jason was waiting behind the apartment door with the chain still on, exactly as instructed, though he opened it with one eye narrowed like a security guard in pajama pants. Annie? It's me. He undid the chain and pulled the door open. You said you were okay. This is not okay. Mabel stepped in. Boy, move aside and let your sister breathe. Jason moved, then saw Detective Monroe. Am I in trouble? No, Monroe said. You followed instructions. That puts you ahead of most adults tonight. Jason looked uncertain whether that was a joke. Annie touched his shoulder. Where's Mom's blue bin? Still under the bed. Why? Because it matters. Jason's face changed. He had learned young that when their mother's papers came out, old pain followed. They went into the small bedroom Elaine Carter had once shared with Annie before Annie gave it to Jason and took the sofa. The blue bin was under the bed, pushed behind old shoes and a box of winter clothes. Annie pulled it out and sat on the floor. For a moment, she could not open it. Mabel lowered herself beside her with a quiet grunt. Want me to? Annie shook her head. No. She snapped the lid loose. Inside were folders, envelopes, rent receipts, medical bills, school notices, and her mother's handwriting on yellow sticky notes. Annie touched one note with 2 fingers. Ask again Monday. Don't let them rush you. Her throat closed. Jason sat on the edge of the bed. I hate that box. I know, Annie said. Monroe crouched nearby but did not reach in. You choose what you hand me. Annie appreciated that. She found the relocation folder near the bottom, its corners bent. The front marked with Elaine's careful handwriting. Building repairs and return papers. She opened it and saw the old forms, the signatures, the temporary housing promise, the language that had sounded official enough to be trusted. Then she saw a business card clipped to the back page. Her fingers went cold. Mabel leaned closer. What is it? Annie lifted the card. Diane Mercer, Community Redevelopment Language Liaison. Below it was an old phone number and an email address ending in mercerbridge.com. Jason whispered, That's the woman from tonight? Annie nodded. Monroe took out an evidence sleeve. May I? Annie handed it over. For the first time that night, anger passed through her stronger than fear. It did not burn wild. It clarified. Her mother had not failed. Her mother had asked the right questions. The wrong person had answered them. Monroe sealed the card, then the folder. This may connect the earlier displacement to tonight's attempted fraud. Jason looked at Annie. So Mom wasn't wrong? Annie turned to him. No, she said. Her voice broke once, then held. Mom wasn't wrong. Mabel closed her eyes. Outside, the patrol car lights reflected faintly against the apartment window, blue and red passing over the walls where Elaine Carter's framed church program still hung near the kitchen. Annie sat on the floor with the open bin in front of her, and for the first time in 6 years, the blame in that room moved to where it belonged. By sunrise, Annie Carter's apartment no longer felt like a private place. It still had the same chipped kitchen table, the same humming refrigerator, the same sofa where she slept when Jason needed the bedroom, but now the room held evidence, sleeves, police notes, and the weight of names that had once seemed too far above them to touch. Detective Monroe stood near the counter, speaking quietly into her phone. Mabel had made coffee without asking where anything was. Because women like Mabel could find coffee in any kitchen on earth. Jason sat at the table in pajama pants and a hoodie, turning one of his mother's old rent receipts between his fingers. Annie sat across from him, watching the receipt bend. Don't fold that, she said. Jason stopped. Sorry. It's okay. No, it's not. He placed it flat on the table. I used to think Mom kept all this because she couldn't let stuff go. Annie looked at the blue bin. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she shouldn't have had to. Jason's eyes stayed on the receipt. She knew. Annie nodded. She knew something was wrong, but nobody believed her. Mabel set a mug in front of Annie. That's not the same as being wrong. Annie wrapped both hands around the mug but did not drink. Monroe ended her call and returned to the table. A warrant request is being prepared for Diane Mercer's devices, her office records, and Mercer Bridge Consulting. Financial Crimes is joining the case. I can't promise speed, but this is moving. Jason looked up. Can they get our building back? The question landed hard because it was a child's question and an adult's pain. Monroe did not lie. I don't know. Buildings get sold, resold, refinanced, hidden inside companies. But records can show how it happened, who signed, who profited, and whether crimes were committed. Jason looked disappointed but not surprised. Children who grow up losing things learn early that justice is not the same as repair. Annie asked, What happens to Diane? That depends on what we find. Tonight gave us attempted fraud, possible witness intimidation, and now a link to prior redevelopment work. Her attorney will fight every word. So will the others. Mabel leaned against the counter. Let them fight. Doesn't mean they win. Monroe looked at Annie. You'll be asked to repeat your statement. More than once. They may question your memory, your education, your job, your motives. They may ask why you didn't speak up 6 years ago. Jason's head snapped up. She was a kid. I know, Monroe said. They'll ask anyway. Annie nodded. She had expected that. People who stole through paperwork always tried to put the victim on trial first. A knock came at the door. Jason stiffened. Monroe held up one hand and moved to the peephole. It's Mr. Hartman and Mr. Reed. Annie looked at Mabel. Mabel shrugged. Your door. Annie stood. Let them in. William entered first. Then Thomas Reed. William had changed his shirt, but not his face. He looked like a man who had not slept and had stopped pretending he might. Thomas carried a leather folder under one arm and 2 paper cups of coffee in the other hand. I didn't know what anyone drank, Thomas said, placing the cups on the table. So I brought bad coffee in case someone wanted to reject it. Jason looked at him. Who are you? Thomas Reed, lawyer, old enough to know better, still working anyway. Jason looked at Annie. Is he okay? For now, Annie said. William remained near the door. He did not step farther into the apartment until Annie looked at him. I can leave, he said. You came here for a reason. Yes. Then say it. He took that in, then nodded. Thomas and I reviewed the addresses Detective Monroe shared. Hartman Development did not directly own your old building at the time you were forced out. Annie felt the answer before he finished. A small part of her had expected denial to arrive dressed as technical truth. William continued. But one of our investment funds bought into the redevelopment portfolio 6 months later. We profited from the property after tenants were removed. Jason stood up. So you did take it. William did not defend himself. My company profited after someone else did the dirty part. That does not make us clean. The room went quiet. Mabel watched him carefully, as if measuring whether the sentence was apology or strategy. Thomas opened his folder. There may be more. Several properties in the same package show similar relocation agreements. Same language pattern. Same liaison references. Mercer Bridge appears in back-end communications, not front-facing forms. Monroe's eyes sharpened. Do you have copies? Thomas held up the folder. For you, once we log how they were obtained, I would enjoy not being accused of contaminating an investigation before breakfast. Annie looked at William. Why are you telling me this here? Because last night I waited until police arrived to tell the truth about how I dismissed you. I don't want to wait again. That sounds nice, Jason said, but it doesn't give us back anything. William turned to him. No, it doesn't. Jason's eyes were red, angry, young. My mom cried over that building. She thought she messed up. She got sick working double shifts after we moved. Everybody says papers like they're just papers. Those papers changed our whole life. Annie started to speak, but Mabel gave a tiny shake of her head. Let the boy say it. William listened. You're right. Jason looked almost annoyed that the answer had not given him something to hit. Thomas sat down slowly across from him. Young man, I have spent most of my life watching powerful people say complicated things to avoid simple blame. What Mr. Hartman just said is simple. It is not enough, but it is not nothing. Jason looked at him. Lawyers always talk like that? Yes, Thomas said. But I charge extra for shorter sentences. Despite himself, Jason looked away to hide a small smile. William placed a sealed envelope on the table. Annie did not touch it. What is that? She asked. Not money for your silence. Her face hardened. He lifted a hand. I know how that sounded. That's why I said it first. It's a letter, signed by me, authorizing Thomas to provide your family with independent legal counsel paid by Hartman Development, not chosen by Hartman Development. You can refuse it. You can pick the lawyer answers to you. Annie looked at Monroe. Is that allowed? Monroe said, It can be, if handled properly. Don't sign anything this morning. Thomas nodded. For the record, that advice is excellent and annoyingly aimed at me. Mabel stepped closer to the table. What else? William looked at her. What do you mean? You didn't cross Chicago before breakfast just to offer a lawyer. No, William said. I'm freezing Hartman's participation in every fund tied to Valterra or Mercer Bridge. I'm ordering an internal review with outside auditors, every property, every relocation, every consultant. If people were displaced through fraud, I want names, dates, payments, documents. Annie watched him. You want? He paused. He had heard the echo from last night. You're right, he said. Let me say it differently. I am responsible for finding out whether my company benefited from stolen homes. What happens after that should involve the families, not just my board. Mabel nodded once. Better. Monroe's phone buzzed. She read the screen and looked up. Diane's attorney is arguing she was only a language contractor. But the warrant affidavit includes Mabel's recording, the witness clause, the Mercer Bridge card, and the phone theft connected to Bellini's driver. Judge is reviewing. Annie looked at the blue bin. My mother's card matters? Yes, Monroe said. It matters a lot. Jason pushed back from the table and walked to the sink. He stood there, facing the window, shoulders tight. Annie followed him. Jay. He wiped his face fast. I'm not crying. I didn't say you were. I just hate that she's not here to know. Annie had no answer for that. She stood beside him and looked through the small kitchen window at the patrol car still parked across the street. She knows, Mabel said from behind them. Jason turned. People always say that. Mabel nodded. Yes, they do. Sometimes because it's easier than saying death is unfair. But I'm saying something else. Your mama knew she wasn't stupid. She knew what they did. Had a smell to it. Maybe she didn't have a badge or a billionaire or a lawyer standing in her kitchen, but she kept the papers. That was her way of refusing to disappear. Annie looked at the blue bin again. Her mother had not left them clutter. She had left testimony. Monroe's phone buzzed again. She answered, listened, then said, Understood. She ended the call and looked at the room. Judge signed the warrant. Diane Mercer's name seemed to enter the apartment with those words. William exhaled once, slow. Thomas closed his folder. Then today becomes expensive. Monroe looked at Annie. And official. Annie sat back down and pulled the relocation folder toward her. The old pages no longer looked like proof of her mother's mistake. They looked like the first loose thread in a fabric someone had woven across whole neighborhoods. William stood near the door, waiting for judgment he had no right to ask for and no way to avoid. Annie looked at him. If this goes public, they'll come after me. Yes, he said. You can't promise they won't. No, you can't fix what happened to my mother by writing checks. No. She appreciated the honesty, even if it hurt. What can you do? She asked. William looked at the blue bin, then at Jason, then at Mabel, then at Detective Monroe. I can stop pretending I didn't benefit because I didn't ask how it was done, he said. And I can put every document I have in the hands of people who will. Annie held his answer for a moment. Then she slid the business card, already sealed in its evidence sleeve, closer to Detective Monroe. Then start with her, Annie said. And don't stop with her. The warrant did not knock politely. By mid-morning, Diane Mercer's office on the 23rd floor of a glass building near Wacker Drive was full of agents, detectives, cardboard evidence boxes, and the sound of drawers opening one after another. Diane sat in a conference room with her attorney, saying very little now. Her silence had changed since the restaurant. At the Sterling Room, silence had been control. Here, under fluorescent lights, it looked more like calculation with fewer exits. Detective Monroe stood beside a desk, while a financial crimes investigator pulled files from a locked cabinet. Thomas Reed waited near the doorway with William. Both of them kept back far enough not to contaminate anything and close enough to understand what was being found. Mercer Bridge Consulting, the investigator said, reading a label from a thin folder. Subcontractor agreements, redevelopment advisory, translation services, tenant communication support. William's face tightened. Tenant communication support. Thomas gave him a sideways look. That is a clean phrase for dirty work. Monroe opened the folder with gloved hands. The first pages were contracts. The next pages were invoices. Then came spreadsheets with addresses, tenant counts, payout estimates, risk notes. She stopped at one column. Language vulnerability. William leaned forward before catching himself. What? Monroe read without emotion. Elderly. Limited English. No legal counsel. Medical hardship. Single parent. Rent delinquency. Likely, compliant. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Likely compliant. God help us. William said nothing. He was thinking of board packets, quarterly returns, polished summaries that used words like acquisition opportunity and neighborhood repositioning. He had seen numbers rise and called it performance. Somewhere under those numbers, someone had written likely compliant beside families. Monroe turned another page. Elaine Carter. William looked up. The investigator moved closer. Monroe read the line carefully. Unit 3. B. Mold complaint. Child with asthma. Tenant requested repair confirmation. Recommended approach. Reassure temporary relocation. Avoid extended explanation of ownership transfer. Liaison. DM. The room went quiet. William closed his eyes once. Thomas spoke first. Detective, may I ask whether that document can be disclosed to Miss Carter through proper channels? Eventually, Monroe said. Not before evidence review. William opened his eyes. She needs to know. She will. Across the hall, Diane's attorney stepped out of the conference room and saw the folder in Monroe's hand. His face told them he understood the morning had become worse for his client. Diane appeared behind him a moment later. She looked at the folder, then at William. You don't understand what those files represent, she said. Monroe looked up, then explained. Diane's attorney said, my client will not be making statements. Diane ignored him. Her voice was quieter now, but the contempt remained. Cities change. Buildings rot. Investors come in because local owners fail. Somebody has to manage transition. William turned toward her. Transition? Yes. Transition. You think every tenant story is pure? You think every building can be saved? You think development happens without pressure? Thomas said, pressure is one thing, deception is another. Diane looked at him. Spare me the courtroom line. William stepped closer, stopping when Monroe lifted a hand. Elaine Carter asked if she could come home. Your file says not to explain the ownership transfer. Diane's face hardened. Because tenants delay necessary projects when they do not understand scale. She understood enough to ask. She was one tenant. She was a person. Diane laughed once. Tired and sharp. Now you say that. After decades of profit. Now, people are people. William took the blow because it was partly true. Diane saw it and pressed harder. Do not stand there and pretend I invented the appetite. Men like you create the market. People like me make it move. Thomas looked at William, warning him without words not to answer too quickly. William answered anyway. Then I will help stop it. Diane smiled. You will help manage damage? There's a difference. Monroe stepped between them. Miss Mercer, your attorney gave good advice. Use it. For once, Diane did. An hour later, Annie sat in a victim services office 2 floors below police headquarters with Mabel on one side and Jason on the other. She had not slept. Her eyes burned. Her uniform had been replaced by yesterday's hoodie, and her mind kept replaying Diane's card in her mother's folder. Detective Monroe entered carrying no file in her hand. That told Annie the news was serious. They found your mother's name, Monroe said. Jason gripped the edge of his chair. Annie asked, in Diane's office? Yes, Mabel whispered. Lord. Monroe sat across from them. I can't give you every detail yet, but I can tell you this. Your mother was not confused. She asked the right questions. The notes we found suggest Diane and others intentionally avoided giving full explanation of the ownership transfer tied to relocation. Jason's face twisted. So they lied. Monroe did not soften it. Yes. Annie looked down at her hands. She had imagined this moment for years without knowing it. She thought proof would feel like triumph. It did not. It felt like finding out the floor had been crooked the whole time, and every bruise from falling had been blamed on your balance. Mabel placed a hand on the back of Annie's chair. Say what you need to say, baby. Annie's mouth opened, but no words came. Jason spoke instead. My mom died thinking she failed us. Monroe's face changed. I'm sorry. Jason shook his head. I don't want sorry. I want them to hear her name. Annie turned to him. He looked at Monroe. Not tenant, not unit, her name. Monroe nodded. Elaine Carter. Jason looked away fast, wiping his face with his sleeve. The door opened after a knock. William stood there with Thomas behind him. Monroe looked to Annie before letting them in. Annie nodded. William entered slowly. He did not carry papers this time. Detective told you? Some, Annie said. I'm sorry. Jason stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. Stop saying that. William stopped. Jason's voice shook. Everybody says sorry when it's already done. Sorry didn't keep my mom from working nights. Sorry didn't bring back our apartment. Sorry didn't make people answer the phone. Mabel started to rise, but Annie touched her wrist. Let him. William looked at Jason. You're right. Jason hated that answer too. Then say something else. William stood with that demand, and for once, no prepared sentence helped him. Your mother's name was in a file this morning, Elaine Carter. They categorized her as likely compliant because she had a sick child and needed repairs. My company later profited from the property package that came out of that process. I cannot undo that, but I will put Hartman's records, funds, and lawyers behind exposing it. Not to protect my reputation, to help build a case. Jason stared at him. And after the cameras leave? William looked at Annie. That is the question, isn't it? Annie said, yes. He nodded. Then don't trust the promise. Trust documents, court filings, escrow accounts, signed commitments, public oversight. Thomas is drafting a framework. It gives affected families, independent counsel, access to property records, and a compensation fund controlled by a third party, not by me. Thomas cleared his throat. And before anyone signs anything, no one signs anything. Especially not this morning. Mabel pointed at him. You, I'm starting to like. Careful, Thomas said. I become more expensive when liked. Annie looked at William. A fund doesn't make it justice. No, he said. It makes it a start. Monroe's phone buzzed. She read, then looked up. Bellini's driver was picked up at a hotel near the river. Annie's phone data shows an attempt to open messages and contacts. He also had a second phone with photos of the staff entrance and a partial screenshot of Annie's employee file. Mabel stood. Employee file? Annie turned to Harold in her mind before remembering he was not there. Monroe continued. The file screenshot came from the restaurant office system. William's face hardened. Harold? Monroe shook her head. Too early. Could be someone with office access. Could be copied from an unlocked terminal. We'll find out. Annie felt tired all the way through, so they had my address. They had part of it, Monroe said. Enough to try. Patrol stays near your building today. Jason whispered. We can't stay there. William began. I can arrange. Annie cut him off. No private hotel. No Hartman car. No place you choose. He stopped. All right. Monroe nodded. Victim Services can arrange temporary safe lodging through the city, not connected to Hartman. Miss Johnson can go with you if she chooses. Mabel scoffed. If? Jason looked relieved for the first time. Thomas's phone rang. He stepped into the hallway to answer. When he returned, his expression had changed. What? William asked. Thomas looked at Monroe first. News has leaked. Annie's stomach dropped. What news? The restaurant incident. Not the whole story yet. A business reporter posted that police responded to a private signing dinner involving Hartman Development and foreign investors. No names for Annie, thank God. But it will not stay quiet. Mabel muttered, Here come the vultures. William looked at Annie. We can keep your name out as long as possible. Monroe said, Maybe, but witnesses saw her. Staff know. Someone will talk. Annie stared at the floor. Last night, invisibility had nearly let them steal in front of her. Now visibility might put a target on her back. Jason said, Don't let them use your name. Annie looked at him. They already used Mom's without saying it. He had no answer. Later that afternoon, the first headline appeared on a local site. Police investigate Hartman dinner after contract dispute. By evening, another outlet had more. Waitress reportedly warned billionaire of translation scheme. Then came comments, speculation, jokes, praise, doubt. Some people called Annie a hero without knowing her name. Others said it sounded fake. Some asked why a waitress knew 3 languages. Others asked why a billionaire did not. Annie sat in a city-arranged safe apartment with Mabel and Jason, watching the story spread across William's phone because she still did not have hers back. She called me a girl, Annie said quietly. Mabel looked over. Who? That reporter. A young waitress. Then somebody in the comments said I was probably planted. Jason leaned over her shoulder. Don't read comments. Comments are where people go when nobody at home wants to hear them talk. Mabel nodded. Boy's right. Annie set the phone down. A message came through to William from Thomas, which he read aloud only after Annie agreed. Diane's devices are in review. Mercer Bridge records show payments connected to Valterra and prior redevelopment projects. Ruiz, Moreau, and Bellini are lawyering up. Bellini's driver may cooperate. William looked at Annie. That matters. Annie sat back. Everything matters now. Yes. No, she said. I mean every word, every signature, every person they thought wouldn't be heard. William understood. The next morning, Detective Monroe called. Her voice was calm, but there was something beneath it. Diane Mercer has been formally arrested. Annie closed her eyes. Jason grabbed her hand. What? Annie repeated it. They arrested Diane. Mabel sat down slowly. Monroe continued through the speaker. Charges are initial. Attempted fraud. Conspiracy-related counts pending review. Witness intimidation. More may follow, as financial records are examined. This is only the beginning. Only the beginning. Annie looked toward the window of the safe apartment. The city outside was bright with ordinary morning. People were driving to work, buying coffee, crossing streets, not knowing that somewhere, a woman named Diane Mercer had finally been made to answer for words she thought no one important would understand. William stood across the room, silent. Annie looked at him. Now you start with the buildings. He nodded. Today. And the families. Yes. And my mother's name. William's voice was quiet. Elaine Carter. Annie held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned back to the phone. Detective, she said, when it's time to give another statement, I'll be ready. Mabel reached over and squeezed her hand. Jason squeezed the other. For years, Annie had carried her mother's papers like a box of old pain. Now those papers had become a map. And for the first time, the people who built the maze were the ones looking for a way out. The courthouse steps were colder than Annie expected. Reporters stood behind metal barricades with cameras, microphones, and questions ready before anyone had answers. William Hartman arrived with Thomas Reed through a side entrance, not because he was hiding, but because Detective Monroe had warned him that this day was not about turning accountability into theater. Annie arrived in a plain coat beside Mabel and Jason, with a victim advocate walking half a step behind them. No one shouted her name at first. Most of the cameras were aimed at William. Then one reporter saw her. Annie Carter? Are you the waitress who stopped the Hartman deal? Jason moved closer to her. Mabel said under her breath, Keep walking. Another reporter called out, Annie, how did you know 3 languages? Did Hartman pay you to come forward? Annie stopped. Mabel turned. Baby. Annie looked at the microphones, the faces, the hunger for a sentence they could cut into pieces. She had spent years being unseen, then one night being seen too much. Neither one felt safe. But behind the cameras were people who had lost apartments, stores, deposits, medical records, old mailboxes, school routes, neighbors, and the right to be told the truth before someone moved their life on paper. William had already stopped near the courthouse door. He did not speak for her. He waited. Annie faced the reporters. No one paid me to hear what I heard. The questions came faster. Were you working undercover? No. Are you suing Hartman Development? I have lawyers now. They'll answer legal questions. Do you consider yourself a hero? Annie almost laughed. I was serving water. That line quieted them more than a speech would have. She continued. They spoke in Spanish, French, and Italian because they thought nobody near them mattered enough to understand. That was their mistake. But this case is bigger than me and bigger than one dinner. My mother, Elaine Carter, signed papers she was lied to about. Other families did too. Say their names when you report this. Not just mine. For the first time, the cameras did not feel like weapons. They felt like windows opened in a room where people had been locked too long. Mabel touched her back. That's enough. Annie nodded and walked inside. The hearing was short. Diane Mercer stood with her attorney, no longer dressed for a private dining room. no longer shielded by wine glasses and foreign clauses. Her face was composed, but Annie could see the effort in it. Alejandro Ruiz appeared by video from a federal holding facility after attempting to leave the country through a private air terminal. Etienne Moreau's attorney argued cooperation. Luca Bellini's driver had already made a statement tying the phone theft to instructions from Bellini's aide, then to Bellini himself. The investigation was spreading across filings, bank records, redevelopment contracts, and emails no one had expected police to read. Diane did not look at Annie until the judge mentioned Elaine Carter's name. Then she turned. Annie met her eyes. There was no apology there, only anger that the past had learned to speak. The judge ordered Diane held under strict conditions pending further proceedings, citing financial resources, witness intimidation concerns, and evidence of coordinated conduct. Annie did not understand every legal phrase, but she understood enough. Diane was not walking out free that morning. Jason leaned close. Mom would have liked that part, Annie whispered. She would have said not to celebrate too early. Jason nodded, then celebrated a little anyway. Annie squeezed his hand. 3 months passed before the public meeting at the Southside Community Center. In that time, the story grew and changed. At first, the headlines called Annie the multilingual waitress. Then the reporters found the relocation files, and the story became something harder to dismiss. Families came forward with folders like Elaine's. Some had kept voicemail recordings. Some had letters with the same phrases. Some had no papers at all, only memory and loss. But this time someone took notes when they spoke. Hartman Development's board tried to control the damage. William did not let them hide behind statements drafted to sound sad without admitting anything. Thomas built the framework he had promised: independent counsel for affected families, a compensation fund managed by a retired judge, public release of reviewed documents, and a commitment to testify where Hartman records showed wrongdoing. It did not make William loved. It made him useful, which Thomas said was a more stable goal. At the community center, folding chairs filled fast. Older residents sat in the front. Former tenants stood along the walls. Reporters lined the back. A few people came only to see whether William Hartman would dare show his face. He did. He stood at the front without a podium between him and the room. Annie sat in the second row beside Mabel and Jason. Detective Monroe stood near the back, not as part of the program, but because open cases had a way of attracting people who disliked exposure. William began simply, "My company profited from redevelopment projects tied to deceptive relocation practices. I did not personally sign those relocation forms. That is not a defense. I benefited because I did not ask enough questions about who was being pushed out and how." A man in the back called, "You asked when the money was good?" William looked at him. "Yes." That answer shifted the room. People were prepared for denial. Agreement left them with their anger still intact but nowhere easy to throw it. William continued, "The fund announced today will not require silence. It will not require families to praise Hartman Development. It will not be controlled by my company. Every affected household may receive independent counsel before any decision is made. The first building records released include the former home of Elaine Carter." Annie's throat tightened. William looked toward her, then back to the room. Mrs. Carter asked the right questions. She deserved honest answers. She did not receive them. Jason lowered his head. Mabel put one hand on his shoulder. After William finished, the retired judge explained the process. Then families spoke. An older man described losing his barbershop after 40 years. A grandmother talked about being moved away from the bus line that took her to dialysis. A teacher said half her students vanished from the neighborhood within one semester because their buildings were transitioned. The word sounded uglier each time someone used it. Then Mabel stood. "I run a kitchen," she said. "I know when something is spoiled. You can put sauce on it, plate it nice, charge $50, and still, underneath, it's spoiled." What happened to these families was spoiled. Don't ask them to be grateful because somebody finally took it out of the refrigerator. People laughed, then clapped, because truth sometimes needed a kitchen voice to make it plain. Annie did not plan to speak. But near the end, the retired judge called her name and asked if she wanted to say anything. She looked at Jason. He shrugged like he was brave enough for both of them and terrified anyway. Annie stood. The room quieted. "My mother kept a blue plastic bin under her bed," she said. "For years. I thought it was just papers, rent receipts, letters, forms, notes. After she died, I didn't want to open it. It felt like opening the worst part of our life. But that bin is why we're here. My mother was not powerful. She did not have a law degree. She did not have money. But she kept proof. She paused, letting the word settle. People like Diane Mercer count on exhaustion. They count on shame. They count on folks blaming themselves. They count on families being too busy surviving to fight sentences written to trap them. My mother blamed herself for not understanding. But she understood the most important thing. Something was wrong, and it needed to be saved. Jason wiped his face openly this time. Annie continued. I didn't stop a crime because I'm special. I stopped one part of it because I listened. And because for once, someone was forced to hear me. That should not be rare. A waitress should be believed when she tells the truth. A tenant should be believed when she asks what a form means. A mother should not need perfect English, a lawyer, and a miracle to keep from being tricked out of her home. The room was silent now. Not empty silence, full silence. Annie looked at William. And people with power should not get credit for discovering humanity after profit. A few people murmured. William accepted it with a small nod. But, Annie said, when they finally open the records, we use them. When they put money in a fund, we make sure it reaches families. When they say a name in public, we make them say all the names. She looked down at the first row, where several former tenants held folders in their laps. My mother's name was Elaine Carter. She was not Unit 3B. She was not likely compliant. She was a woman who asked to come home. No one clapped at first. Then one older woman stood. Then another. Then Jason. Then the whole room rose. Not for a billionaire, not for a headline, but for a woman who had kept papers when no one listened. 6 months later, Annie no longer worked at the Sterling Room. She did not leave because Harold fired her. He would not have dared, and Mabel would not have allowed it. She left because Thomas Reed helped her find a paid position with a legal aid clinic as a community language assistant while she started evening classes. Thomas insisted he had done very little. Mabel said that was the first modest lie he had told all year. The clinic was not glamorous. The chairs were old. The coffee was worse than the police stations. But every day, people came in with envelopes, forms, notices, bills, contracts, and fear. Annie sat with them and read slowly, sometimes in English, sometimes Spanish, sometimes French, sometimes Italian. Sometimes she simply asked, "Who explained this to you?" That question changed rooms. William Hartman visited once, months after the first settlements began. He came without cameras and waited in the lobby until Annie had finished helping an older man understand a medical lien. "You look busy," he said. "I am. That's good. Sometimes." He nodded. "The first checks went out today. I heard. There will be more. There better be." He almost smiled. "Thomas said you would say that. Thomas is learning." William looked around the clinic. "I wanted to tell you something. Hartman is withdrawing from 2 more funds. The records were bad. Not illegal in the clean way lawyers argue about, but bad. Bad matters. I know that now." Annie studied him. "Do you?" He accepted the question. "I'm trying to know it before someone like you has to stop me." That answer was better than confidence. Annie walked him to the door. Outside, Chicago moved through an ordinary afternoon. Buses sighed at curbs. A woman pushed a stroller past a man selling fruit cups. Somewhere, someone was signing something they did not understand. William paused. "Do you ever think about that night?" Annie looked through the clinic window at the waiting room, where a mother held a folder in one hand and her child's coat in the other. "Yes," she said. "What part?" "The part where I almost walked away." He lowered his eyes. "But you didn't," he said. "No," Annie said. "I didn't." After he left, Annie returned to her desk. A woman sat down across from her, nervous, holding a packet from a landlord. "They told me it's just temporary," the woman said. "But I don't understand this part." Annie took the papers gently. "What's your name?" she asked. "Rosa." "All right, Rosa. We'll read it together." The woman exhaled as if someone had opened a window. Annie looked at the first page, then the second. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, the words waited to be understood. And this time, nobody at the table was invisible. The lesson of this story is that truth does not become smaller just because it comes from someone society overlooks. Annie was only a waitress in the eyes of the powerful, but she saw what others ignored, listened when others assumed she could not understand, and found the courage to speak when silence would have been safer. Her story reminds us that injustice often hides behind polished words, legal papers, and polite smiles, but one honest voice can expose what power tries to bury. It also teaches that real justice is not only about stopping one crime, it is about remembering every person harmed, restoring dignity, and making sure no one is treated as invisible again. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.